This program was recorded on Monday, May the 20th, in the year of our Lord 2019. The opinions expressed by the participants in the following program do not necessarily represent that of this station or its management.
Or anybody else.
From the John DeVita recording studio, located in an undisclosed and clandestine location on the great northwest side of our fair city of Chicago, we once again are pleased to be presenting yet another edition of our monthly roundtable panel discussion show, Meet the Chicago Historians. Now here's the guy who started it all, John DeVita.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Richard Lang from the John DeVita Broadcast Center. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another broadcast of Meet the Chicago Historians on the Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network on Monday, May the 20th, and that is the year of 2019. Today, the panel will be talking about DDay, Eisenhower, Hitler, and of course, much, much, much more. So sit back and enjoy Meet the Chicago Historians. And now to start today's broadcast, here's our announcer, Mr. Richard Lang.
And now, here's today's panel moderator, John S. Kuchelko. John?
Thank you very much, Rich, and it's good to be with you for this May edition of Meet the Chicago Historians. We're going to be talking about one of the great events of the 20th century, indeed one of the great events in world history, and one of the most important military engagements ever waged on this planet. The landings on the Normandy beaches, the great province of Normandy in France, on D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944. So we'll hope you'll be interested in that. It's appropriate this month because this month, in just a number of days, we'll be observing Memorial Day. Whether you look at the traditional date of May the 30th, known for many years as Decoration Day, I think some of us can remember, at least I remember when my mom and dad and my aunts and uncles called it Decoration Day, the date by which it was known from its beginnings. We celebrated VE Day at the beginning of this month. May 7th and 8th marked the surrender of the Third Reich to General Eisenhower and the Allied forces in Europe on May the 7th at a little schoolhouse in the city of Reims in France, which was then marked the following day on May the 8th by a more elaborate ceremony that the Russians insisted on. So another ceremony was held in Berlin, presided over by the Soviets. And, of course, this past Saturday was Armed Forces Day, not one of the most recognized or best-known dates on the calendar, but it's a date set aside to honor all of our armed services, although each of them have an individual day. There's Navy Day in October, and there are separate dates for the Air Force and the Marines, the U.S. Army. But it's an appropriate month to be talking about military history, so welcome. This is our May edition of Meet the Chicago Historians. Well, I always like to remind you, don't try to find us, folks. Don't try to locate us. We're a highly secretive site, deep underground. There's so many checkpoints and so much barbed wire and guards that you would have to get through to find us. It would be too much of a hassle. So don't try to locate us. We're down here at the celebrated John DeVita Broadcast Center. So now what I'd like to do is to go around the table and, as we do each week, introduce our guests and our regular panelists. And we have a guest with us today. I'll start with him to my right, a gentleman who's been here once before, talking about the tragic fire of Our Lady of the Angels. So let's give each person an opportunity to come in and sign in, please.
There
John
we
Daly
go. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I am Jim Gibbons. No, I'm not the fellow from Eyewitness News. He's been dead for at least 25 years. Very well respected, but it's not him. I am also not Jim Gibbons of Goodwill Industries, so don't send me all your clothes because I'm not him, okay? However, I have goodwill for all of you for listening in. I am Jim Gibbons, historian, and I love to do history programs. I have approximately 100 of them that I do. One of the main people I believe that we're going to be talking about today will be Eisenhower, so I'm going to be looking very, very forward to speaking about General Dwight D. Eisenhower. So There we go.
Thank you very much. So yes, and the topic, as our producer, executive producer John DeVita said, it's D-Day, Eisenhower, and Schicklgruber. Sometimes known by the name of Hitler. Now we'll go to one of our regular panelists, Tom.
Tom McKenna, retired Chicago police officer, lifelong friend of our regular moderator, John Ryan. I spoke with John's wife last night. John is not doing well, for those of you that may or may not know. John's in a nursing home, for lack of a better word. He fell, he hit his head. This has now been probably several months ago. And they don't know if the injuries were a result of the fall or a minor stroke. And then while he was in the nursing home, I heard that he fell again, injured his head. He took some more stitches. They took him to the hospital. Again, I wish I had better news, but he is still with us. We thank God for that. And he is of very good spirits, as we all who know and love John know that he has a very positive attitude about things and about life. So hopefully that attitude will continue, and we wish him a very speedy recovery, and hopefully very soon he'll be back with us here as our moderator.
You're here.
Thanks a lot, Tom. And we know, of course, you've been a lifelong friend, and as you always used to say, you're one of the very few that was willing to admit to it.
I still actually admit to be a lifelong friend of John Ryan.
But John Red, it doesn't represent his politics, Ryan, as we always called him. Great guy. If he has an opportunity to listen in on this broadcast, we miss you, John. We all wish you the best, and hope indeed that you will be able to be back with us in the very near future. So thanks, Tom. Thanks for that acknowledgement of our regular moderator, John Jack Red Ryan. Okay, now our next panelist is one of our, you're not a guest, you're not a long-time panelist, you're kind of what they say an in-between, so if you would please, sir, would come in and sign in, please.
Okay, I get my crayon out and everything. My name is Don Peter, I'm from Oak Park, Illinois. I'm a member and a volunteer for the Fire Museum of Greater Chicago, which are going to have a muster on June the 15th at the Chicago Fire Academy at West Taylor and Jefferson, and it's free. You might have to pay a couple bucks for a hot dog, but everybody's welcome, and get wet, and there's going to be a parade and anything I can't think of.
Okay, thank you very much. And you mentioned the Chicago Fire Museum, and we have here the impresario of the Chicago Fire Museum, so we'll give him an opportunity to come in and sign in, please, Bill.
Well, Bill Kugelman, is that impresario? Is that a nice word? Or
as soon as he finds out what that means, he's going to thank you or be upset.
46 years with the Chicago Fire Department and the Chicago Fire Museum now, in which 5218 South Western Avenue, we're going to have an open house on the 25th, this next Saturday, from 10 until 2 o'clock. So anybody interested, bring your camera and visit us. It's just the start. It's very interesting. I can't say enough about it. We've had some great people working with us, and it certainly isn't the city of Chicago, but it's the Chicago Fire Department. So please, come see us the 25th.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a great, I think we've all had an opportunity to be there. We did one of our broadcasts many years ago. We did a broadcast from the Chicago Fire Museum, which ironically was the day we learned that Joseph J. Gentile, the man who was the impresario of WJJG Radio, the origin of this program and of so many other broadcasts, had passed away on the day we were doing our taping.
John, that was Monday, October the 11th, the year 2011. 2011.
2011. So it's
Yep.
hard to believe it's already been 8
Yeah.
years
Yep.
since that took place. I mean, as they say, it doesn't seem that long ago, but
And I tell you, as I sit here and look at Joe right here in front of me, I miss him.
I'm sure I got to know him at the very end when I began doing broadcasting at WJJG. He was a great guy, great benefactor of Loyola University. I think it was one of his passions. He had been an auto dealer on the north side, civic leader. I just came across a photograph in an old edition of our Life newspaper and I'll have to bring it next time. I didn't bring it this time, but next time I'll bring it, of Joe Gentile at an event in Cicero and Berwyn with Judy Bart Topinka, who also did broadcasting on WJJG, and she was the one that brought me into the station and had me take over her program as an alternating host. So Joe Gentile was a great guy, and he passed away the day we were doing a broadcast from the Fire Museum. So you have an open house on the 25th. It's always a great place to visit. There's much fire memorabilia there, the history of the fire department in Chicago, as well as a statue of Christopher Columbus.
Exactly, from the Columbian Exposition. And
Impressive
by the
statue.
way, Joe is also a benefactor, excuse me, a benefactor of the school. Gee, I hate to say this. I forgot the name of the
Loyola.
school.
No, St. Ignatius.
St. Ignatius.
St. Ignatius
St.
High
Ignatius.
I'm
School.
just
Oh.
kidding. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, their gym and their student center there.
Yeah.
It's beautiful if you've never been there.
Yes, he's done that, and Joe was quite a guy. Quite a guy.
He must have been educated by the Jesuits because he contributed to St. Ignatius, which
And
is a
Loyola.
Jesuit high school, and Loyola, which
Yep.
is a Jesuit university. So and I took some classes at Loyola as well, so I think well of Loyola. And that leaves us with one more panelist to introduce, and that is our intrepid announcer who opened our broadcast today. So, Rich, would you like to come in and sign in, please?
I certainly would. Thank you, John. I'm your announcer, Richard Lang. I've done some teaching of modern European and American history, but lately, in more recent years, under the guidance of Ken Little, who none of us will forget, become knowledgeable of Chicago history, especially neighborhood history. That's quite a subject in itself.
Yep.
And I'm also active in a group that recreates old-time radio shows. Those of you who remember people like Jack Benny and Fibber McGee and
Amos and
Molly.
Andy.
I
did you do that too?
certainly do.
Now cut that out.
Silly kid.
That's right. I used to have a good time watching those programs.
We just about did it in your imagination. Yeah.
Someone once said that radio was better than television because the pictures were better.
That's correct.
That's a new one.
Take it
That's
for
interesting.
somebody who used to watch quite well.
Just this weekend up in Wisconsin, Channel 10, which is the PBS stations, like we have Channel 11 here, they did a fundraiser, and the special was all about Bob Hope. When Bob used to have his first television show that they showed that,
There was
and
a trooper.
then also all the programs he did on for the armed forces on when he used to go to different places, and of course they had guest stars such as Milton Berle and Jack Benny, and all those great entertainers that are no longer with us.
Bob Hope was a comedian that could tell political jokes without insulting people,
That's right.
as opposed
He had a
to our
knack for that.
present
You're right.
comedians.
Yep, that's
He always did political humor, but it wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't.
It wasn't
bitter.
insulting.
Not
wasn't
mean-spirited,
negative.
right.
He was. I've seen the tape of him with FDR in 1944, and he's saying we don't talk politics, but I want you to know I've always voted for President Roosevelt. My father before me always voted for President Roosevelt, and I think my grandfather. And FDR's there just, with his head back laughing uproariously at it.
Right, while they were in England.
So we've gone done our round robin around the table, and this is our May edition. We're taping on the 20th day of May in the year of our Lord 2019, and it's customary we start off with an opportunity if anyone wants to talk about any of the news of the day. This is something Jack always did. We would address any topics of interest in the news of the day. So before we go into our our actual scheduled topic. Does anyone wish to talk about there? Tom McKenna.
Well, on my way here, I caught the tail end of our new mayor's inauguration speech. Like all inaugural speeches by politicians around the world, very optimistic. Historical event. She isn't the first black mayor, and she isn't the first female mayor, but she's the first combination of the two. And to add a little frosting on the cake, she's also a lesbian, which is very interesting. But as I told people during the campaign, when they asked me who I was voting for, I told them that I was voting for Lori. And they asked me why, and I said because her and I have one thing in common. We both like white women. Now, I was going to say she's a female lesbian, and then that would be redundant, but I was corrected when I said that to someone else, because now there are, I suppose, at last count, there are 17 different genders. Now, it's not male or female, because the mayor of New York City, who just threw his hat in the ring, is another of, I think at last count there's 367 Democrats running for
They've found there is a city councilman in Dubuque, Iowa, who is a Democrat who is not running for president.
Right.
He is apparently the only Democrat office holder in the country who is not running for president. He's a newly elected city councilman in Dubuque. And he's not running for president.
As a Republican.
And to tie this together, the mayor of New York is married to a black female lesbian. I think she declared that she is actually a female lesbian. So as opposed to one of the other 17 different sexual orientations you can claim now.
And they did take a survey. I think it was 78% of the people in New York did not want de Blasio to run for president of the United States, and they're the people who know him best.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's going to be. Well, we can get more into that later on. But again, so we have a new mayor to look forward to.
Will we have to, throughout the country, will we have to have, say, 7 different bathrooms for all of these people?
No, they solved that problem.
Oh.
Well, one bathroom for all.
Oh, okay.
Right. So it alleviates. You don't have to have male and female. Just
okay.
one bathroom. Actually, I was in Canada, and they already started that in Quebec. It's just a restroom.
Well, that takes over from France, and I spent my time in France, and that's the way it was over there.
Yeah. So no more male, female, whatever.
That's right.
Mayor Emanuel has walked off into the sunset. I saw him leaving office on Friday leaving City Hall after his 8 years as mayor of the city of Chicago.
Well, like I said, I ask anyone I know that lives in the city, I said, would you want to be mayor of Chicago? I mean, I wouldn't. If someone walked up to me and said, hey, Tom, guess what? You know,
we had a
who is it that said if I'm nominated, I will not run. If I'm elected, I will not serve.
General Sherman.
Yeah,
General
right.
Sherman.
Yeah, that's. I mean, who would want to inherit this mess that all the previous mayors have created?
Maybe you can answer this, Tom. The mayor, now I can say the previous mayor, did he not take away medical hospitalization for retirees?
Retirees' health insurance. He wanted everyone to go on Obamacare.
Yeah. So he took it away, and nobody's brought that up. I haven't seen that in the paper yet.
It's going to be interesting. I mean, our new mayor already decided that she's not going to have Chicago police as her bodyguard detail.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
She's going to have some. So my question to her is: can every citizen select a different venue for?
Did she give an explanation as to what the reason for that was?
Who knows?
I mean,
she wanted federal.
But I mean, I welcome the idea. I mean, you know, if she can have, you know, U.S. Marshals or FBI or private security, I welcome that. That way, when I call, you know, when I need assistance with law enforcement, can I call the FBI? Have the jurisdiction? What if I have a problem with a neighbor's dog? can I call in
Call
the
the state police?
No, I want to call in the CIA and station a sniper to solve that problem immediately. I mean, the stuff is insane. I mean, was that well thought out? I'm not going to have Chicago police protect me, as every other mayor in the history of the city did.
Yeah.
But the citizens, you're stuck with the Chicago police. I mean, that's basically what you're saying. And this is like the first order of business. I can't wait to see what's coming down the road. I mean, is she going to have her own fire department? Maybe her own fire range or private fire security.
Give everybody a bucket of water.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is it's just insane.
Yeah.
It's like the gun control advocate. Someone Hillary naturally being anti-gun. Did a picture of her, and I think there were 17 other people in the photograph, and they said all 17 of these people surrounding Hillary Clinton are carrying firearms.
Oh.
I mean, seriously? I have a concealed carry permit. Well, I'm a retired police officer, so they enacted a federal law about 10, 12 years ago now, where retired police officers can carry concealed carry. You have to qualify every year, just like when you're on the job, but you can conceal carry anywhere in the United States. But if I could have armed security following me around constantly, I wouldn't need a concealed carry permit.
If you're an individual, if you're surrounded by armed security guards, I can see why you can't understand why anybody should feel the need to carry a gun. I mean, that's very, very dangerous and divisive to, for the ordinary citizen, to carry, who doesn't have the benefit of platoons of security guards.
Some of these people are so far removed from reality. I like the question when they say about, well, someone has a weapon that has a magazine capacity of 17 rounds. So they ask the question, now, do you really need that weapon? Or let's say an AR-15. Do you need that weapon? I mean, do you really need that? This is coming from people that live in homes that have 12 bedrooms and 15 bathrooms and an acre of grass that consumes all kind of water, electricity, and energy, and they're asking someone if they really need a 17-round capacity magazine.
Well, it's comparable to the celebrities who arrive in Cannes, France, in their private jet, to complain about global warming and the overuse of energy in our society.
Yeah. But I mean, if everything was on what you really need, they've got a garage with 7 cars. Do you really need that weapon with 17 rounds? Yeah. Well, same way you need what you've got. Yeah. I can afford it and I want it. So. And if it's not against the law, I'm getting it. Period.
Well, I think de Blasio, if I'm not mistaken, de Blasio said one of the problems in our society is there's too much money in the hands of the wrong people. Now, he apparently knows who the right people are. That was the he didn't say the follow-on. I think that's an actual quotation from the economic discrepancies in our society are symbolized by the fact that there's too much money in the hands of the wrong people. He apparently knows who the right people are, and he's going to transfer the money from the wrong people to the right people.
Like I said, these people, they know everything, and it's their duty to protect us from it. It was like the outlaw in New York of soft drinks, I believe over 16 ounces, because they know what's really good for us.
Yeah, it's called the nanny state.
Do you think that when he's talking about money being in the hands of wrong people, that he was talking about politicians?
No. No, he's just saying people are too wealthy. There's too many people. Too many of the wrong people are wealthy.
Right.
Now, the fact that they accumulated that money, that doesn't enter into the picture. It's just that he believes that money would be better off in the hands probably of people who go to the polls and vote for him.
AKA income redistribution.
Yeah. I mean, that was a fascinating line. There's too much money in the hands of the wrong people. And The premise is that I know who the right people are, and you elect me to office, and I'll take the money away from the wrong people, and you just better hope that you're one of the right people that's going to be on the receiving end, and not one of the wrong people who's going to be on the removal end.
Well, the president of Venezuela, I think, thought that he had the same idea.
I think it's pretty much the same.
He knew who the right people were, but then he ran out of money to give to his friends, and then everything went down the drain.
Yeah.
I was very
pockets.
proud of my my brother-in-law. He had a lot of money, and he employed a lot of people. And his wife was always after him to, let's go to Florida. They had a big place down there, and Gene said no. He says, I got to be up here. And she just couldn't understand that if he let those businesses go, those people would be out of work. And he was the guy that was employing them. And God bless him, God rest his soul. Gene was, he came from, he was a copper. He's a Park District copper. And he came from, an ordinary, normal family. And that's the way it was. The money didn't really mean anything to him, except to help other people. And I always thought that's the way it should be. Too bad everybody doesn't have that type of
well, I mean, that's
thoughts.
That's the backbone of the U.S. economy, small businesses, people like him, and employing people, businesses with 5, I believe 10 employees, That's why all the regulations, while they hurt larger businesses, they absolutely destroy smaller businesses. The stories are legendary about how some businesses had to close because of government regulation. They just couldn't afford it.
Well, the allegation's always been made that very often big business likes regulation because they have the staff to deal with it. They can hire the attorneys and the consultants and the accountants to deal with the regulations. They're able to thrive, but then it eliminates their competition. The small fry, the people who can't afford platoons of lawyers and accountants, they're the ones that are squeezed out by government regulation. That's why very often major corporations aren't that upset with government regulation.
Right.
They could probably write it off, too.
Yeah. Another thing that's been in the news before we come up on the end of this half hour, we're going to be talking about World War II. There's been talk of war in the Persian Gulf. The president moved the Abraham Lincoln supercarrier into the Persian Gulf with other ships and B-52 bombers. And the B-52 bombers that plane was designed during the Truman administration. It's amazing. The B-52 is still flying, ladies and gentlemen. The last B-52 rolled off the assembly line in 1962. And those planes are still in the inventory. Not all of them, just a small number. The last grouping of B-52s, but they're still in the inventory, and some B-52s were moved into the Persian Gulf by the president to give a cautionary note to the Iranian government this past week.
So hopefully it works.
Didn't they send another warship somewhere near China, because they were saying their stuff.
They're trying to close. The Chinese are trying to close off certain passages and certain regions of the South China Sea, claiming it's their territorial waters.
Right.
No one else respects that, but the South Koreans and the Japanese and even Vietnam and Indonesia, they're all upset at this. The United States has been sending warships into those areas just to demonstrate that no, this is open sea.
I think they just sent one.
You can't declare this to be your private territory.
Right.
So that has been going on in the East as well. Well, we're coming up on 12:30, ladies and gentlemen. So we'll be I'll pass the baton to our announcer.
That's right, John. That means it's now time for a brief intermission. You're listening to Meet the Chicago Historians.
Do you know someone that has constant pain? of their low back, neck, shoulder, knee, or wrist? Have they tried medications, exercise, physical therapy, or chiropractic, and nothing seemed to make it better? Well, I may have your answer. Why not try a napropath? Hi everybody, this is Dr. Wayne Chickowitz, and I've been practicing 30 years treating pain. I'm board certified and hold a diplomate in pain management. For your convenience, we have 2 locations. In Cicero, 3602 South 61st Avenue, 708-656-7000, or in Villa Park at 122 West St. Charles Road, Suite 1A, 630-833-4007. Why not try a napropath and stop the pain today?
Now, back to our show. John?
Well, thank you very much, Rich Lang, our announcer. And once again, this is the May edition of Meet the Chicago Historians from the John DeVita Broadcast Center. And as we customarily do, we spent our first segment talking about a few items of the news of the day, the inauguration of a new mayor in the city of Chicago, some of the political news around the country, all the myriad candidates for president on the Democratic side, and a little bit about the current imbroglios in the Middle East. But our topic today, we're going to talk about an event coming up. We're going to be marking the 75th anniversary in just a matter of days of what was called the longest day, what Cornelius Ryan described in his great book as the longest day. And it's believed to be a quotation from Field Marshal Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel, who commanded Army Group B of the German forces and was on the scene in Western Europe at the time that the Allies landed their forces on the beaches of Normandy, the ancient province of Normandy in France. He said that both for the Allies and for Germany, that day would be the longest day. And I'm sure many of you I'm sure everyone remembers the great motion picture that Daryl Zanuck produced in the early 1960s from that from that book, which starred virtually every male star in Hollywood, Great Britain, and France, and Germany who was available for filming at that time, including John Wayne and Henry Fonda as Brigadier General Ted Roosevelt, the eldest son of Theodore Roosevelt. Great, great movie. I'll say a few words about that maybe later, but that's our topic today. We're going to talk about D-Day, Eisenhower, then General Dwight D. Eisenhower, 4-star General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the Supreme Allied Commander, and Schicklgruber, Hitler. So,
hey, John,
yes.
I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but in any discussion, the first one that mentions Hitler loses.
Oh, that's been pointed out to me once.
Right.
I was in a debate once. I was in a debate with a fellow once, and I made an allusion to to the similarities of some of what the left does today to the policies of Hitler, whom I deem to have been on the left as well. And he became indignant, and he says, in the rules of high school debate, the first person who mentioned Hitler loses the debate. And I said, well, my friend, maybe you're still debating at a high school level, so but I moved beyond that many years ago, so right. I don't necessarily adhere to that regulation. He didn't appreciate that. He did not appreciate that.
Wasn't Rommel back in Germany at a birthday party for
his wife
during
he had left
the actual invasion
on June the 6th? Rommel was not in Normandy, was not in Paris. He had gone back to Germany for something. He was from southwestern Germany. He had gone back for his wife's birthday, and it's one of the critical fact that there were several other high-ranking officers who weren't there on June the 6th, and it contributed to the confusion on the German side. One of the things that benefited the Allies was the confusion on the German side, and the fact that they had so many divisions on the German side as to how to meet the invasion when it came. Von Rundstedt wanted to hold back, wait till the Allies came ashore, and then throw them back into the sea. Rommel wanted to meet them on the beaches. Rommel was the one who was responsible for all of those obstacles that you see in the movies, those triangular steel girders that were embedded,
tank traps,
the barbed wire. He planted millions of mines. He wanted machine gun nests at every possible. He believed in stopping the invasion on the beaches. And of course, but there were others like von Rundstedt who thought differently, and they never could agree. And so they wound up with a hodgepodge of everybody's ideas going into the mix.
Right.
But Rommel was the man responsible for all of the traps and tricks and obstacles that you see in the films and the documentary films of the land.
Was he responsible for having most of the troops way north, where the narrowest part of the English Channel? Was that Hitler?
Pas de Calais. Actually, Hitler thought the attack would come in Normandy. Hitler personally thought that there would come an attack in Normandy, but when it came, Hitler decided that this was just a preliminary invasion and that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, which is the narrowest strip between Britain and France. And it was Hitler then who refused to release the armored forces, the panzer units that they had up there, because he believed this was just a diversion and the real invasion is going to come at the Pas de Calais. And there have been movies which they show, von Rundstedt pleading with Hitler, and Hitler adamantly refusing to release the forces, and Keitel and his other commanders. But the Allies truly benefited from the divisions in Germany, from Hitler's inspired leadership of the German armed forces, and the fact that there was this lack of unanimity as to how to deal with the invasion.
And then they, on the other side, who was it that they had a fake army that they blew up all tanks? And who was it they sent as the
Patton?
Patton, right?
George Patton, who was the best, the American officer best known by the Germans, because they'd faced him in North Africa and they faced him in the Mediterranean.
But that was
Patton was in disfavor because of the slapping incident. And so he was placed in command of this fictitious army of rubber tanks, and everything was fictitious. They had fictitious radio. We now know that it was much more than just dummy tanks and dummy aircraft. They were generating all sorts of radio transmissions that gave the impression that there were troops. They had recordings of tanks moving so that there would be the sounds of in this area that there was troops on the march. It was one of the most elaborate deception efforts ever used in military, and it was very successful. Because the Germans naturally believed, and there was with some justification, that we would use our best field commander in the invasion. They didn't realize, they couldn't believe that an American officer of Patton's ability would be sidelined simply because he slapped a malingering officer in a hospital tent. But since Patton was there commanding these forces of the Pas de Calais invasion, that was another thing that contributed to them holding their forces there until it was too late. And another factor that was important in D-Day was that the Air Force was so successful in cutting the bridges and cutting the roads and isolating Normandy. They had blown up the Air Forces, the RAF and the U.S. Army Air Forces had been so successful in destroying the bridges on the rivers leading in that surrounded Normandy that it was pretty much isolated. It was very difficult for the Germans to move equipment or tanks in because all of their avenues had been destroyed in the run-up to the war with the air power attacks. And so it turned out to be a very well thought out and a very successful build. And it's the greatest amphibious, to this day, the greatest amphibious invasion in world history.
Just putting D-Day into context with the rest of the fighting in World War II, wasn't it virtually simultaneous with the Allies capturing of Rome?
Right.
Almost the same day.
I think it was the night before. I think they had been on the air. The FDR had given, I think, some words about the fall of Rome, which was June the 5th, I believe. June the 5th.
Sounds right.
Rome fell.
And that's an often neglected part of World War II, the slog up the Italian border peninsula. Very severe fighting.
Well, the war in Europe, I mean, those who fought in other theaters often feel that there's kind of a disproportionate amount of attention given to the war in Europe. My dad fought in the Pacific, under MacArthur. The Marines, of course, virtually all of our Marines fought in the Pacific, and that was where the war began, with Pearl Harbor. Those that were in the North Africa, I had my uncle's brother fought in North Africa. So those who were in these other theaters sometimes feel that a disproportionate amount of attention. But the fact is that FDR and Churchill had decided that Hitler was the greater threat, Germany was the greater threat than Japan, and had to be dealt with first. And that's why the war in Europe got the lion's share of all the munitions, the equipment, the troops, and everything.
I wonder if there was much debate on that, since it was Japan that attacked us. Many Californians thought there would be an imminent Japanese invasion.
Sure. Right.
But largely, I think, with Churchill,
right,
Germany was given priority.
Well, didn't Roosevelt give a lot of Lend-Lease stuff to England before the war started?
We were giving Lend-Lease began in 1941, long before Pearl Harbor. Lend-Lease was given to the British, and then when Germany invaded Russia, we gave Lend-Lease to Russia. And the fact of the matter is, Russia would have been knocked out of the war if it hadn't been for the gigantic Lend-Lease support that they got from the United States. Trucks, ammunition, rations,
factories,
everything, uniforms. They were eating American rations, wearing American-made uniforms, driving American-made trucks, flying American-made planes, shooting American ammunition. It was staggering, the amount. And the Russians, of course, don't like to acknowledge this. They like to claim that they claim they won the war single-handedly. They would have been knocked out of the war by the Germans if it hadn't been for all that support the U.S. gave.
They did incur the most casualties. What they had, like 20 million casualties during the war?
Sure. Oh, yeah, the Germans, Germany and Russia lost staggering numbers of men on the that was a slugfest on the Eastern Front. And one of the reasons is because neither of the commanders cared about the lives of their soldiers. Stalin, in particular, would sacrifice thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions if necessary.
That's in the first wave in with weapons.
Oh, yeah.
And then the next wave were weaponless, and they tell them, get the weapons from the ones that fell before you. Unbelievable.
And another thing, the Soviet armies on the Eastern Front, they had what was called then the NKVD. We would know it today as the KGB. They kept changing the names of their secret police. But they would have NKVD division. The NKVD had it was like the Waffen SS. They had armed units with tanks and artillery. They would have NKVD units behind the front lines to shoot anyone deserting. Any of their own Russian troops. Anyone who attempted to desert would be shot down. So and that was known. That there's no attempt, and that includes even retreating. Even if you're being driven back, you were supposed to die where you stood. There was no such thing as retreat.
Nope.
And there's always a discussion, too, that if the Germans had invaded Russia and not been delayed by troubles in Greece and the Balkans, if the Germans had captured Moscow and Leningrad, that could have only been a symbolic defeat for the Russians. They would have kept on fighting.
Oh, yeah.
Very little, because they had put much of their industry already into the
and they had lost. They lost Moscow to Napoleon 130 years earlier, and still continued to fight on.
Russia's biggest ally was the weather.
Yeah.
That was the coldest winter probably in history.
And the Germans were not prepared for a winter war. No doubt. We have a guest. I'd like to give him an opportunity to get on this.
2 cents.
Here, my 2 cents worth, okay? Stalin was duped, period. Hitler was smart. Oh, I just said the name. Hitler was extremely intelligent. He just wound up wooing Stalin. What we're going to do is this. We're going to take Poland. So what we're going to do is we're going to form a secret alliance together, okay, between the Nazi government and Stalin, and we're going to take Poland. And what it's going to wind up being is, okay, we're going to go in, and this is per Winston Churchill's History of the Second World War, 6-volume set, okay? What we're going to do is we are going to go in and attack, particularly Warsaw, just keep banging and banging and banging and banging until eventually we'll bring him to submission. And then from there, what we're going to wind up doing is, you guys can get the spoils afterwards. So what he did was he got Stalin rather happy, smiling, all this stuff. Stalin didn't dream he was going to turn on him. And so what do you mean you're suddenly turning on me? In fact, what Hitler did was he keeps Stalin fat and happy over here in 1939. At that particular point, right before they were going to attack Poland. Here finally comes Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain, and he's going to turn around and says, you attack Poland, we're declaring war. What do you think about that, Hitler? And Hitler just like, blow it out your tail end, it's too late. We're already there, we've already got you. So the war will start September of 1939, and at that particular point, that's when the Stalin figures everything's fine. Not realizing in 1940 what's going to happen is Luxembourg, Belgium, France, and the Netherlands are going to be in one day. It's going to be, I want to say it's like May 10th of 1940 when Hitler takes it all in one day. Then he turns around, what's he going to do? I'm going to go after Great Britain and I'm going to go after Russia at the exact same time. Whoops. Now, the reason why we got involved in that war, okay, was because of the Netherlands. This is poor Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, which happens to be No Ordinary Time and won a Pulitzer Prize. That, as well as Winston Churchill's The History of the Second World War book, okay? What it is, it's 90% of our rubber comes from the Dutch East Indies. Yipes, that's Japan. Now we've got a problem because what do we have? We have three people that are big with the Axis powers. That's great. That's Mussolini for Italy. We've got for Germany, we have Hitler. And then for Japan, there's Tojo in there, who's directly under Hirohito. What they're doing is we're taking our own territory. We're going to take as much as we can, as quick as we can, because guess what? You guys are in a depression. You guys are in trouble. And so all this stuff is going on. In the meantime, though, what we're going to have is those countries are taken right away. They start to turn on to he's worried, meaning FDR is worried about the Japanese going after the Dutch East Indies. So what about September 16th of 1940, I believe it's around in there, September, around in there, he is going to, FDR is going to have the first peacetime draft coming in there, and the guys are being drafted before the war because he suddenly can realize, hey, we've got a problem over here with the Dutch East Indies because 90% of our rubber comes from there. So then you're going to have Winston Churchill. He is going to approach FDR and he's going to say, can you please help us in this war? FDR is going to say, I wish I could help you. The drawback is we can't get involved in the war. The United States wants to be neutral. But I have an idea. It's called Lend-Lease. What we will do is we will lend you 50 naval destroyers so you can kind of fight your battle over there, right? 50 naval destroyers we will lend you, and then you can lease us some of the islands out there.
Now, that's a separate agreement. Lend-Lease was separate from the destroyer deal. That was a separate deal where they gave the British the 50 overage destroyers, and in return they got leases on the bases in Bermuda and other British possessions. But Lend-Lease was just straight aid. It was theoretically.
Well, there was also tanks and guns and planes, if I'm not mistaken, involved in this thing.
Right. What I'm saying is, it wasn't tied in to them giving us the bases in the Caribbean and so forth. That was just. FDR used the argument. He says, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't charge him for the use of your garden hose. You give him the garden hose and let him use it. And then when the war is over, he'll give you the garden hose back and pay you for it. So that was the analogy he used to Lend-Lease. That we're going to lend them these tanks and planes and guns and equipment. And then when the war is over, they'll give them back to us. Well, people accepted that. It was a subterfuge because that equipment is all going to be used up. It's all going to be shot up and destroyed. But it was the way he was able to get it through. That he wasn't just giving them equipment. We were lending them the equipment and leasing them the equipment, and then they're going to give it back to us.
Yes.
And Congress was not involved, right?
Congress had to. That was how he could get it through Congress because you had this isolationist mentality in Congress. We had been burned by the First World War. In the eyes of the American people, we had been suckered in the First World War. Wilson tells everyone we're fighting this war to make the world safe for democracy. And at the end of the war, we come away with nothing. The British and the French get colonies. The American people decided that we're never going to do this again. We're never going to go across the ocean again and pull Europe's chestnuts out of the fire. So he had to deal with this mentality in Congress, in the Senate, in the House. The only way... The tragedy is that when the British really needed help now, when we were facing a real monster in Hitler, We paid for all the propaganda that we used in the First World War, accusing the Kaiser of having been a monster when he really wasn't, of exaggerating how bad the Germans were in World War I. Now we're facing a real lunatic.
Just the opposite.
But people, it's like crying wolf. It's like the old story of crying wolf. Nobody believed it. So it was very difficult for FDR. All during the 30s, he's making attempts to get the United States to rearm, and Congress wanted nothing of it. The press wanted nothing of it because they didn't want to make the same mistake they'd done in the First World War. So he had to use these tricks, these deceptions, like Lend-Lease, in order to give the British the aid that they need. Because Britain, at the beginning of the war, they had to pay for everything. British had to pay for all the equipment they got from the United States. It was all cash on the barrelhead. And by 1941, they were out of cash. They had exhausted all their reserves.
Right.
So in order to keep Britain in the war, FDR comes up with this notion of Lend-Lease. And the thing is, Roosevelt decided early on that Hitler had to be defeated. That if Hitler became triumphant in Europe, it would be a bad development for the United States. He had to be stopped. He thought it could be done by giving aid, giving support. He finally came to realize that the only way Hitler was going to be stopped was if the United States stopped him. There was no other force on earth that was going to stop Hitler. But the problem is, the American people did not want to get involved in another war. And we didn't get involved in the war until the Japanese, on the other side of the war, attacked Pearl Harbor. And then Hitler committed the monumental stupidity of all time. He declares war on the United States and loses the war with the stroke of the pen, declaring war on the United States.
Is there anything to it? I've heard that the Second World War was pretty much a continuation of the First World War.
Well, in the sense that the same countries are involved, but the issues.
Per Winston Churchill,
it's different. It's different.
Per Winston Churchill, yes, it was a continuation of World War I. Per Winston Churchill.
Okay.
But that implies that you're dealing with
a Band-Aid put on it originally, okay, and so they said we're going to have another war. It's going to continue on, and this is per Winston Churchill's 6-volume set.
Yeah.
Right. And I heard that after the First World War, they divided up a lot of countries. Yes, but Japan was pretty much left out of it, and it kind of pissed them off.
Actually, well, yes, yes.
Got a number of Pacific islands from Germany or Japan, but overall they did not gain that much. You're right.
No, but they were kind of shunned, and
very good point.
A lot of people said that might have had something to do with Pearl Harbor too.
But they weren't a major combatant in World War I anyway.
But you got to remember, Japan was an ally of the British in the First World War. So the whole Pacific side of World War II has nothing whatever to do with World War I. I mean, it's not a continuation of World War I because Japan had been allied with the good guys. Japan was one of the allies of Britain in World War I. They had picked up all the German colonies.
Right.
Many of the islands that we had to then invade in World War II were originally German colonies that the Japanese had picked up very easily in World War I. Japan benefits from World War I because they're right on the scene. They're able to go out and grab all these German islands in the Pacific without any interference.
Right.
They come away as a very easy winner in World War I.
Okay.
Just as a footnote, when the Japanese overran the Dutch East Indies, what did that do to our rubber situation? I mean, with strict rationing, we all know this during the war, but did that spur the development of synthetic rubber?
Yes,
absolutely.
It did.
Absolutely.
And we were using much synthetic rubber at the end of the war. That's a good point.
Yes. That came in around 1940, right about that time period when Goodrich came out with that.
Right. But Ford had a big Fordlandia down in South America
rubber
somewhere.
Trees, yeah.
And what kind of put them out of business was the synthetic rubber stuff. But the facilities are still there, and the government is kind of rebuilding it and using it for their own people.
Because the Japanese held all of those, they held the Dutch East Indies during the war, and yet we were able to manage quite well using synthetics. We were able to get over that problem. And oil wasn't a problem because the United States was the biggest oil producer in the world. at that time. So losing oil production didn't mean anything in World War II in terms of the U.S. having all
That's
that.
Latin America.
But what was this thing of Japan buying a lot of scrap from the U.S.?
Well, that's always the story, given that we were selling all this scrap metal to the Japanese, which they then made into bullets and used again. And that's one of the things you always heard about.
Right. I don't know if there's anything to it or not, but
I imagine there is truth to it, that we were it was trade as usual with the Japanese.
Right.
In fact, one of the things we did, we embargoed oil on Japan.
And scrap.
And that was the Japanese used that as one of their arguments for why they had to strike out, that the United States, as though somehow the United States had an obligation to sell oil to them, which obviously you don't.
They had absolutely no oil, though, didn't they?
No, yeah, Japan has no oil at all of its own.
Right. In the timeline of this, where does you spoke of Hitler and Stalin and Chamberlain, where does the timeline of this fit in with Chamberlain's return to England with the waving the peace in our time?
Well,
it was the Munich crisis.
That was 1938. That was September of 1938.
So that was
the Sudetenland.
Prior to this.
Yeah, the Germans, they do it step by step. Hitler had all these, and the problem is that there was a lot of opinion in Britain, in France, even in the United States, that we had been too hard on the Germans. And there's some justification that we had been too hard on the Germans, and Hitler played on that, saying, I just want all this territory back, which was German to begin with. So he has the Anschluss with Austria. People in Austria speak German. There's evidently real sentiment in favor of being united with Germany and Austria, at least among some people. Not the Baron von Trapp and Julie Andrews; they weren't in favor of it.
They sung too much.
But but there were people that support it. He wanted the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia. It had been part of the Austrian Empire in World War I, so it had been ruled by Vienna. And Czechoslovakia becomes an independent country at the end of World War I, but they have all these Germans living there. So Hitler played on this. Well, I just want these German-speaking people back in the German Reich. Problem is, that Czechoslovakia had built fortifications right on that border. And so when you gave the Sudetenland back to Hitler, they got the best defense lines that the Czechs had to defend their country were gone, because they'd fortified that border, and that's where the Sudetenland was.
Okay.
But Chamberlain's attitude was, if we just give Hitler this, it'll satisfy.
Didn't he sign a treaty with Hitler too?
They signed a naval agreement with Hitler in 1935. They signed like a non-aggression pact.
Right.
That when he came back waving the little piece of paper. I believe this is peace in our time.
Right.
And Churchill said that he had to choose between war and dishonor. He chose dishonor. He will get war. And of course, within a year's time, he was right. The Munich Agreement is September 38. The war begins in September of 39.
Right.
So that was really about his last bloodless acquisition. His next target was Poland after he got the Sudetenland. He had promised Chamberlain that was his last territorial demand, the Sudetenland. That's September of 38. In March of 39, he marches into Prague. He takes all the rest of Czechoslovakia. He incorporates the Czech part into the Reich. He sets up a dummy Slovak state, because it's Czechoslovakia. It's Bohemia and Slovakia. He sets up a supposedly independent Slovak state, which is really under the control of Berlin. He takes a little territory up in the Baltics called Memel, which had been taken away from Germany. He grabs that in 1939, and still no one goes to war. And then finally his next target is Poland, and that's where Chamberlain finally decides we're going to draw the line. We're not going to negotiate. We're not going to accommodate. We're not going to appease him. If he attacks Poland, we will go to war. Hitler attacks Poland, and that begins the war, September of 1939.
Now, right after Poland is when he started bombing the UK, right?
No. He enters into this agreement with Stalin, which Mr. Gibbons referred to. He enters into this non-aggression pact with Stalin, which gives him the green light to go into Poland. The Germans invade Poland September the 1st of 1939. The Russians invade Poland September the 17th of 1939. They come in from the opposite direction and crush the Poles between the two of them. Okay. Russia operated as an ally of Germany for the first 2 years of the war.
Okay.
They were in cahoots with Germany. They were supplying the Germans with coal and iron and everything that all the raw materials that the German Wehrmacht needed. Russia was supplying it to them. He takes Poland, and then he wheels around. He wanted to wheel around in the west immediately, but the weather, his generals insisted the weather was no longer good. By October, they didn't want to be launching an invasion in the west. So he waits until the following year. In April, he takes Denmark, almost without a shot. The Danish army was tiny. When he gets to Copenhagen, the king's personal guards opened fire on him. When they got to the gates of the palace in Copenhagen, the king's personal bodyguard opened fire on the Germans, and the king personally came out and told them to lay down their arms. He didn't want all of his men massacred by the Germans. They take Norway in April. The British send troops into Norway, and then in May he launches the invasion in the west. Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and France. And by the middle of June, it's over. It's a matter of weeks. It's over with. The French are just crushed. And no one could conceive of this. The French and the British had fought for 4 years in the First World War. They were in this stalemate for 4 years. No one could believe that the Germans were going to overwhelm the French and the British and the Belgians in a matter of weeks. But it happened. The French were dependent on the Maginot Line. They sent armies up into Belgium. They're cut off. The Germans drive right between the two. They send their main force right between the British armies and French that moved into Belgium and the Maginot Line. They drive to the Channel. The war is virtually over. Mm-hmm. The British evacuate their troops at Dunkirk. They get virtually all of their troops, and we'll continue our story.
You've been listening to Meet the Chicago Historians, and we thank you for it. We'll be right back.
So after France, the only thing...
Well, friends, believe it or not, but spring is here, according to the calendar. But the last few weeks, we've had some terrible, terrible heavy rainstorms. And you may want to check the roof, siding, and gutters on your home to be sure that they're in good shape. You don't want mold or mildew or drip, drip, drip in your attic, crawl space, or on the ceilings in your rooms, or have walls damaged by leaky gutters and bad siding. So don't have double expense. Sooner or later, you're going to have to get it fixed. So call Best Brothers Roofing, Siding, and Gutters at 630-616-1359. Mike Besh will drive over in a shiny red truck with ladders on top. Mike will give you an estimate, look over your roof, siding, and gutters, give you an estimate, and go from there. Once again, you don't want to have double expense. Call Best Brothers Roofing, Siding, and Gutters for a free estimate, and you can call them at 630-616-1359. That's Best Brothers Roofing, Siding, and Gutters at area code 630-616-1359. Call today for a free estimate. And of course, there's more rain to come. Oh yes, this week we're supposed to get some more heavy rain. So make sure that the roof, siding, and gutters on your home are in good shape. Call Best Brothers Siding, Roofing, and Gutters at area code 630-616-1359.
Now back to our discussion. John.
Well, thank you very much, Rich Lang. I'm John Escacholco. This is Meet the Chicago Historians. We're here at the John DeVita Broadcast Center for our May edition of Meet the Chicago Historians. Our spacious, I wish you could come down and see the spacious facilities that we have here for the Chicago Historians. It's deep underground. We can't disclose the location for obvious reasons.
John, the new cafeteria is amazing.
Oh, that's true.
Oh,
yeah.
The food is good.
Oh, it's great. It's just amazing. One of the finest buffets I've seen anywhere.
Right.
There isn't a
Prime
broadcast
rib.
center in America that has the kind of food service that we have here.
That's right.
So it's a shame we can't share it with you folks. But I'd like to go around the table once again and give each of our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. And I'll start with our intrepid announcer here.
I am your announcer, Rich Lang.
And I am not your announcer, Don Peter.
Tom McKenna, and while I am a registered Democrat, I am not running for president.
Oh, you're the second one.
Yes.
Second
Registered
one.
Democrat.
I'm Jim Gibbons, historian, not of Eyewitness News.
And I'm Bill Kugelman from the Fire Museum of Greater Chicago.
And I'm John Escacholco, your host. And, of course, we send our best wishes to Jack Red Ryan,
For sure.
our good friend and pal who can't be with us again. He's been under the weather, but we wish him the best. And if you're listening, Jack, we hope to see you back here very soon. We're talking about World War II. Talking about D-Day, the 75th anniversary. It's hard to believe. I can remember watching the 40th anniversary services in 1984 when Ronald Reagan, I think, really began our modern revival of interest in and respect for the World War II generation, which we now call the greatest generation. I know that Tom Brokaw gets a lot of credit for this, but I really think that Ronald Reagan began that whole idea in June of 1984 when he gave those stirring speeches in France, when particularly the one, "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men that took the cliffs." He just and he, of course, himself was a World War II veteran. He had served in the Army in World War II, not in combat, but he was in uniform. He'd been in the National Guard before the war, so he was a World War II veteran. And I think that began this sense of honor and respect that we have for the World War II, the greatest generation, as we call them.
You know, John, on that note, I play with the pipes and drums at the Chicago Police Department. They have, I don't know if it's every month or every other month, they have what's known as an honor flight. It flies out of and back into Midway Airport, and it takes World War II veterans to see the World War II memorial, because at the rate that they are dying, I believe it's 1,000 a day. And so we play, they have Navy recruits. The next one is this coming Wednesday night at Midway Airport. And then they have Navy recruits from Great Lakes to escort them off the plane. Most of them are in wheelchairs. And I've got to tell you, if you have an ounce of patriotic blood in your system, when you see these guys getting off that plane in wheelchairs, some of them wearing some of their World War II paraphernalia that they still have, wearing the baseball caps with their unit designations. And a story that comes to mind, these guys, we were standing there, and there was kind of a lull in the ceremony, and I was right next to one of the veterans, and naturally we shook hands, and I said, "Thank you for your service," and he said, "Thank you for yours." And he put his arms on his hands on the arms of the wheelchair, and with great difficulty, because I told him, I says, "No, please, don't, just stay seated." He pushed himself up out of the wheelchair and saluted me. I'm telling you, if that doesn't bring, it certainly brought tears to my, thinking back on it now, I'm getting teary-eyed thinking about it. But when they refer, and jog my memory, referring to these men as the greatest generation was not an understatement.
I've always been deeply proud of the fact that my father, Private First Class John Ellis Kachulko, who was born and raised in Kansas, was a combat infantry soldier in World War II in the Pacific. He won the Bronze Star for heroism. He saved a lieutenant's life, pulled a lieutenant who was under Japanese fire and injured back into the American lines. I've always been proud of my dad and proud of the World War II veterans. I had an uncle who served in Patton's Third Army in Europe. I had another uncle who served in Europe. I've been involved in veterans programs for years with the town. And I mean, you just can't say enough. They truly saved the world. They defended this country and they saved the world. If it had not been for the United States Armed Forces, the Japanese and the Germans would have triumphed in World War II.
Absolutely.
Brave as the British were, Britain would have been overwhelmed. And the Russians as well. The Russians had lots and lots of soldiers, but they just couldn't produce all the equipment that they needed to stop the German forces. It was America that turned the tide. And, you know, we owe a debt of gratitude to the World War II generation.
And another real sad part about it is young people today, especially high school age students, they don't know if World War I came before or after World War II. That's how sad that is about learning or educating young people about history. They have no idea.
Patton or MacArthur.
Who was fighting on what
Nimitz
side in those wars?
Totally meaningless.
Nothing.
Not only World War II, Vietnam and Iraq.
Anything.
They don't even have any idea what they were.
One of our topics was we talk about D-Day, and we've got some time. D-Day and Eisenhower and Hitler. Eisenhower, of course, Dwight David Eisenhower was the commander of the American forces, and he was the supreme Allied commander. I don't know if any of you've seen probably seen the Tom Selleck film, where Tom Selleck portrays Eisenhower on the prelude to the D-Day, and I'm not sure the title of it. It's a great, if you haven't a chance to see it, it's available in DVD. It's a made-for-television movie that was made maybe about 10 years ago or so.
I missed.
It's great.
John Young.
I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head, but Selleck plays. You might not think of Tom Selleck as a fit for Eisenhower, but he does a great job. He doesn't try to impersonate Ike. He doesn't try to sound like Ike, but they've got him made up where he looks reasonably like Eisenhower, and they go into his dealings with Churchill and with de Gaulle and with when they present the plan to the King and Queen of England. And it's all done from the headquarters. There's no battle scenes in it, just the headquarters and how they're preparing for the invasion. And it ends with the launching of the invasion. But great presentation. Ike, of course, is the great hero. I've got a picture. This is probably one of the best-known pictures of the European theater. Ike meeting with the paratroopers just before the invasion was about to begin, and everyone expected that the paratroopers were going to have grievous casualties. And in the event, the casualties were not as heavy as they had expected, so they were grateful. But Dwight David Eisenhower becomes the great hero of the European theater of the war. Under him, Montgomery is the commander of the actual ground forces in the invasion. So, Jim, I know you wanted to talk. Would you wanted to talk about Eisenhower? Would you care to comment about Dwight Eisenhower and his role as Supreme Commander?
He was one of the greatest commanders we ever had. My personal opinion with him is he's the fourth greatest president we ever had. Eisenhower did not want to be like MacArthur. He trained under MacArthur, but he did not want to be like MacArthur. He wanted to be able to put himself out towards his people. When he first came in, when he was going to be approaching the 101st Airborne, they said, just give your name, rank, and serial number to, the general. Well, the general suddenly comes on and he's starting to talk directly to his people. And he says, where are you from? This kind of stuff, because he also needed to find out what their thinking was on the war. He was actually told beforehand, listen, you need to plan for Normandy. You need to be able to plan for all this stuff. You don't have time to speak to soldiers. His end of it was, I need to make the time to speak to them because they're the ones that are out there they're out there fighting. And they will know some of the hidden spots that I don't know. And so what's going to need to happen here is I'm going to need to talk to them. And also they have to know who's leading them. If they can't trust him, that's another thing, right? So he's going to form that trust with his people. They said his driver said that he had tears in his eyes as they were taking off. That 101st, they thought that over 70% were going to lose their lives that day. It wound up being 20, which is still high. And so you take a look at something like that. He's a great man. Also, I consider him to be, say, if you had like a circus, he would wind up being the ringmaster of the finest stallions you're ever going to work with, because he had to deal with a whole bunch of people out there. One of them is going to wind up being, Patton, who is his good friend. They helped perfect the tank together. But you had FDR in there. You had Harry Truman eventually he's going to have to deal with. He had to deal with Stalin. He had to deal with Churchill. He had to deal with de Gaulle. And he also had to deal with General George Marshall, who was his boss. And just to let you know, for one of the first times Marshall and FDR were talking together, FDR is going to say, well, hello, George. And he's going to say, "You please, call me General Marshall." That's the President of the United States. So you have that type of a thing. So Eisenhower, and plus he also had Omar Bradley in there, who was fantastic to deal with. Bradley, by the way, is going to write a book called The Soldier's Story. Eventually that's going to be called Patton, the movie Patton. So Eisenhower is going to have to deal again with him. And then a fellow by the name of Bernard Montgomery is his name. Field Marshal Montgomery of Great Britain. They said of all of them, you put all the finicky ones together, he was the most finicky. In fact, he actually told Eisenhower at one point, I don't know why you're in charge of the Supreme Allied Commander. You weren't even in World War I. So there you go. So Eisenhower had very, very good temperament, and I felt he was the perfect person for the time. And
Jim, if I could interrupt, was
Yes.
Eisenhower given the chain of command about the most logical man to assume this responsibility, or others bypass? Is there much of a story whether politics were involved or contact, personal contact, the choosing of Eisenhower over some of these other names?
Can I just see,
Yes.
Eisenhower, on December the 1st, 1941, Eisenhower became a one-star general. He had been a colonel. He was a colonel
Lieutenant
during
colonel,
most of 1941. He got his first star just before Pearl Harbor.
Right.
Eisenhower was relatively unknown. He had graduated first from the Army Staff College. He was a brilliant man. He graduated first in his class when he went to the Army Staff College, I think in 1926. He was a brilliant man, but he always played it down. Eisenhower was the opposite of MacArthur, as you said. MacArthur wanted to project the image of greatness. Eisenhower felt that you want to project this image of being just one of the guys, but he wasn't
smart.
just one of the guys.
Wasn't Eisenhower's one of his famous quotes, I could have learned theatrics from MacArthur?
Studying from MacArthur.
Yeah, the different personalities, very different.
Eisenhower is plucked out of obscurity and put into the War Plans Division after Pearl Harbor. He's deputy chief of war plans in the Pentagon in 1942. He has to lay out for the brass the plans that are being assembled for dealing with this war that we're now in the early months of 42. And he impresses everyone so well, including Marshall, that they decide to send him overseas to organize. And he is then very quickly sent to Europe. He's a two-star general, and he's sent to Europe. And he gets his second star very quickly. He gets his third star. I mean, he goes from being, in November of 1941, he's a colonel. In December of 1944, he's a five-star general. That shows you how quickly he rose through the ranks.
Very, very good.
But Marshall thought that he would just be the man that would go over there and organize the forces, and then when it came time to lead the invasion, Marshall would go overseas and become the actual commander. That was Marshall's thought. FDR decided at this point he didn't want Marshall out of Washington, D.C. FDR depended on Marshall. He had a very good relationship with Marshall, and he said, George, I wouldn't sleep at night if you were not in Washington. And Marshall, as he has to salute and say, yes, sir. So that's why Eisenhower and to today, how many people know the name of George C. Marshall compared to Dwight D. Eisenhower?
And the irony of Eisenhower having a very Germanic name too must not have been lost upon the Nazi chiefs.
And wasn't his staff generals? They all went to the same class in West Point together.
Bradley and he
Bradley
were together,
and
correct.
Patton.
class of 15 was they
Right.
called it class. The West Point class of 15 was called the class that the stars fell upon.
Yeah.
Because so many of this 1915 class of West Point, so many of them wind up generals in World War II.
Eisenhower, I always look at as being somebody who kept pursuing things. Prime examples, he was turned down at Annapolis, would you believe? Turned down there, and all of a sudden then he becomes a 5-star general on the for the Army. So you kind of look at that, it's like, wow. Eisenhower has been dead this year 50 years,
Yes.
March 28th, he's been dead.
69.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so with that, he brought in so much stuff. My gosh, he brought in the interstate highway system
Right.
because he
That's
saw
right.
Hitler's Autobahn out there. And so his end of it is we need to be able to get, excuse me, Jeeps and planes and Jeeps and tanks and land planes on the expressway system. That is for our defense. He also saw what was going on, with our enemies. So he brought in the 49th state, which is Alaska. He's also going to bring in the 50th state, which is Hawaii. Alaska is to watch what? Russia. Hawaii is to watch Japan. So we have that. We also had problems with the space program with Sputnik out there back about 1957. The little Russian traveler.
Beep,
Okay.
beep, beep, beep.
Yep, he's going to come up with something which is called NASA, which is going to start a whole space program. So Eisenhower, I thought, was absolutely huge.
Right.
And like I said, you're right. Eisenhower, he did things more of a hidden hand behind the scenes. He didn't have to go tweeting or anything like that. He figures he'll just do it behind the scenes and take care of it.
Right.
And he certainly did.
But there's
Jim, I think you're very right. Most historians evaluating Eisenhower's presidency are ranking it quite high.
Oh, my
Much
gosh,
better than
yeah.
they did 20, 30 years ago.
Yes.
And Eisenhower's mother was a pacifist. She belonged to one of
Yes.
these little pacifist religious sects. She didn't want her son to, like the old song, she didn't want her son to be a soldier. He went to West Point, tried to get to Annapolis, mainly so he could get a free education.
Yep.
He
Right.
wanted a college education,
Yes.
and if you went to West Point, you didn't have to pay. So that was really
That's right.
the motivating force. I'm kind of proud of him because he was born in Texas, but he grew up in my dad's home state. He grew up in Kansas.
There you go.
He's a native Kansan. And there's a great story told about Hitler going to an astrologer. When they used to believe Hitler was one who believed in astrology. He really didn't. But at the beginning of the war, he went to an astrologer to say, "I'm going to launch a war for the conquest of Europe, and I want to know what the result is going to be." And the astrologer says, "Well, mein Führer, is there is good news once there is bad news? Give me the good news first." He said, "Well, the good news is that in this war you are launching, Europe will be conquered by a great German general." Ah, that is wonderful. That is just what I thought. What could possibly be the bad news about that? He says, "Well, mein Führer, the name of this German general is Eisenhower, and he comes from someplace called Kansas."
Beautiful. That's what
And isn't it
I like
kind of neat that he got turned down by Annapolis because he
Isn't that-
probably ended up in the South Pacific?
Isn't that something? You take a look at that and it's like, wow. Wow, there's reasons for everything out there. There definitely is. And Eisenhower, like I said, he was the right person at the right time at the right spot. And like I said, I rank him the fourth greatest president we ever had. Most of our things today, all of our defense, all that kind of stuff is under his watch.
And and I don't mean this as a criticism, but it is true. He rose to be a 5-star general, and it's often said he never heard a shot fired in anger in his entire career. He never commanded troops in battle. He never commanded a company or a division.
Yeah.
He never served as it wasn't his fault. He desperately wanted to get into the First World War.
Oh,
he was
did he?
kept in the States as a training officer. He had the ability to train, and so he was kept in the States training. MacArthur, Patton, Marshall, all served overseas in World War I. Patton was already involved with tanks in World War I. Marshall was on Pershing's staff. Eisenhower had to stay in the States, and it just galled him that he didn't get into combat in the First World War.
Well, weren't Patton and Eisenhower developing
They were
tanks together?
buddies.
Yeah.
They were
Can't
buddies.
made-
They were close friends, and Patton outranked Eisenhower for most of their
Right.
career. Patton was some years older than Ike.
And
Patton was, I think, 10 years older than Eisenhower
I
was.
said it on a few occasions. Patton was the best general he ever had, but he couldn't keep him under control.
I'm a great admirer of Patton. He was a tremendous field general. He made public relations mistakes, but those were mistakes that in no other army in the world would it have meant a thing. I mean, if a German or even a British general wouldn't have suffered for the things that caused Patton to have all these problems in his career. Saying things. He said things about the Russians that were absolutely true. He didn't trust the Russians, but unfortunately he said them too soon. You know, he was a man ahead of his time. He foresaw what the Russians were going to be in just a few years, but no one wanted to hear that in 1943 and 44.
Was it what he was supposed to let the Russians into some city first?
Well,
and then he said, I'm not going to do it, so the Russians keep coming in, and who do they meet? Patton.
The Russians, of course, got to Berlin first.
Right.
And I know I always feel that, you know, it should have been the United States and Britain. It would have meant so much more if you'd seen the American flag and the British flag being unfurled over the ruins of the Reichstag rather than the Soviet hammer and sickle. But on the other hand, how many Americans and how many British would have had to die for that honor?
Right.
The Russians were willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of men just for that picture of the red flag being unfurled over Berlin. Ike didn't see the point of that. To him, Berlin was not a military target. Didn't mean anything. It was just a ruined city. Ike believed, as American military doctrine is, you destroy the enemy's army. You don't worry about his capital city. That doesn't mean anything. You destroy the enemy's army. And so Ike was the one. FDR wanted Berlin. Churchill wanted Berlin. Montgomery wanted Berlin. The only one who didn't want Berlin was Patton, and he was the man. He was the man that had the decision. Was Eisenhower? Excuse me. It was Eisenhower. Eisenhower made the decision. We're not going to race to Berlin, and we almost certainly would have gotten there first. The Germans probably would have laid down their arms. They would have been glad to turn the city over to the Americans rather than to have the Russians, which they knew was the only alternative left.
Yeah.
But there would have been SS that would have fought to the last ditch, and a lot of GIs would have died, and Eisenhower. So it's a call. It's a G. They argue to this day about whether we should have gone there.
There was a documentary. They were talking to American GIs, and they were talking about the Wehrmacht in SS and the Gestapo. He says the Wehrmacht, they were just like us. They were drafted.
The regular armed
He says, but the SS and the Gestapo, he says, if we ran across them, we just shot them.
Yeah, well, that was, and the SS, they had their own military formations. They weren't just a secret police. They had troops and tanks and guns and divisions, and the SS became a full-fledged branch of service under Hitler, and they were willing to fight.
And they were political, whereas the
Wehrmacht
Nazis weren't particularly. They were just like GIs. They got drafted.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on our break in just a few moments. We're talking about World War II. We're talking about DDay, Eisenhower, a fellow named Hitler, whose name pops up in stories of the Second World War. We're here at the John DeVita Broadcast Center. This is the May edition of Meet the Chicago Historians. We've had a chance to talk a little bit about the accomplishments of Dwight David Eisenhower. There's a great scene in that documentary where Montgomery comes up to Eisenhower. They're going to do this presentation at the British headquarters, and Ike begins to light a cigarette, and Monty says, "Sorry about that, Ike. I don't allow smoking in my headquarters." And Ike says, "Oh, all right, Monty, if it's so important," and he puts his cigarette away. In comes His Majesty the King and the Queen.
There's no to smoke.
And the King comes in, and naturally the great. And as the King sits down, he pulls out a silver cigarette case, pulls out a cigarette, and like 5 lighters come out to light his cigarette. Churchill reaches into his pocket and pulls out a cigar the size of a telephone pole and lights up. And you can just see Montgomery just steaming in the background. And Ike kind of chuckles, and he pulls his cigarette out again and then lights it up. Well, Rich Lang, our announcer, it's time for you.
It's officially announced that we'll be right back after these messages of interest and importance.
Were there any American troops?
Hello, friends. Are you looking for a place to have some printing done? Well, I have the right place for you to go, and that is the printing store in Oak Park, Illinois. Call or see Phil Berry at 621 Madison Street, or call 708-383-3638. Phil Berry will sit down with you and help you plan whatever you need printed. Now his products are brochures, booklets, business cards, catalogs, envelopes, letterheads, flyers, invitations, newsletters, notepads, menus, mailers, manuals, labels, posters, postcards, price list, NCR forms, sale sheets, table tents, pocket folders, and presentation forms. And he also has 1 to 4 color offset printing, digital copying, high-speed copying, graphic designs, typesetting, laminating, foil stamping, die cutting, and imprinting. And his complete bindery service includes booklets, cutting, scoring, folding, numbering, padding, and drilling. So once again, for all your printing needs, call or see Phil Berry at the printing store at 621 Madison Street in Oak Park, Illinois, or call 708-383-3638. They are located at Madison Street and Clarence, just east of Oak Park Avenue. And that's at 621 Madison Street in Oak Park, Illinois, or give Phil Berry a call at 708-383-3638. For all your printing needs, the printing store is there to help you. They're 621 Madison Street in Oak Park, Illinois. And once again, you can call Phil Berry at 708-383-3638.
Now, back to our show. John.
Well, thank you very much, Rich. This is Meet the Chicago Historians, our May edition here at the John DeVita Broadcast Center. And we're talking about World War II. We're talking about D-Day with the upcoming 75th anniversary of the landings on Normandy, The Longest Day. That great film with John Wayne and Henry Fonda and Edmund O'Brien and just a host of others. Robert Ryan. You could just go on the list of all the great stars. Richard Burton is in the film and many others. So we're talking about D-Day. We talked a little bit about General Dwight Eisenhower. He was a 4-star general at the time of D-Day. He would become one of our first World War II 5-star generals of the Army. That rank was created in World War II because our soldiers, our leaders, were dealing with British field marshals and marshals of the Soviet Union, and on the other side were German field marshals, and we had no equivalent rank at that time. So Congress created the rank of General of the Army with 5 stars and Fleet Admiral for the Navy with 5 stars. And 7 officers were appointed to that rank during World War II, 4 generals. The generals were George C. Marshall, who was the Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur, who was the commander of American forces in the Southwest Pacific, Henry H. Hap Arnold, who was the equivalent of Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Of course, the Air Force was not a separate service in World War II. It was the United States Army Air Forces. But it had grown so large and so important that he was considered to be a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the 4th was Dwight David Eisenhower. He was actually the 3rd in terms of seniority. He was the 3rd after Marshall and MacArthur. And Ike received his 5th star just before the Battle of the Bulge. He receives his 5th star in December of '44, just at the time. So if you see documentaries and films about the Battle of the Bulge, you'll notice he's now wearing the 5-star, the circle of 5 stars on his shoulder for World War II. Monty became a field marshal in the aftermath of D-Day as well. Monty became a field marshal in September of 44. So for a short time, Monty outranked Eisenhower because he was a field marshal before Ike had gotten his 5th star. So the third part of our triad is of course the man who launched the war, the evil and malevolent Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich. Who wants to weigh in first? Who would like to say something about Schicklgruber?
A little question. Give us a little background on the name Schicklgruber. Was that the original family name? Yeah.
Hitler's father was originally named Schicklgruber.
Okay.
Hitler's father, as I recall, was born illegitimate, and it was Hitler's father's mother had the name Schicklgruber. So at the beginning of his life, Hitler's father's name was I can never pronounce his name. It's Alois. It's spelled A-L-O-Y-S. Alois. His father was Alois Schicklgruber until his actual father came forward and admitted paternity, and he became Alois Hitler. Adolf Hitler was never known as Schicklgruber. I mean, Adolf Hitler was from birth was Schicklgruber. By the time he was born, his father's name had been changed to Hitler. But people picked up on this. People learned the story, and so as a way of mocking him and ridiculing him, he was often referred to as Schicklgruber.
I think to some, Hitler sounds like an artificial name, as is Stalin to some degree.
Yeah, Stalin is an artificial name. Stalin means man of steel.
Right.
And in the Bolshevik Revolution, all these men took, not all, but some of them took pseudonyms. Trotsky's name was not Trotsky. His real name was Bronstein. His real name. Molotov's real name was Scriabin. He had an IN name for real, and he changed it to Molotov to sound more Russian. And Stalin's name was Jugashvili. His real name was Joseph Vissarionovich, which means his father's name was Vissarion. Vissarionovich means son of Vissarion, and his last name begins with a DJ, Jugashvili. And he changed his name to Stalin, which means the man of steel.
Yeah, bad name for a company leader like that, right?
Stalin was actually the man of steel before Clark Kent. That term that term man of steel was used by Time magazine in the 30s. They would refer to him sarcastically as the man of steel because he really wasn't a man of steel. He was a little guy. He had never been a soldier. He was a political agitator. But if you read in the 1930s, they will refer to Stalin in Time magazine. And Time magazine liked to use these tricks of words. They would call him the man of steel before the beginning of Superman in 1938. So he was actually used. He actually probably could claim that term before Clark Kent.
Was it ever confirmed that he had any Jewish background?
Hitler?
Yeah.
There's always been those rumors.
Yeah,
rumors and
but that's why I asked if it was confirmed.
I don't know that anyone's ever verified. I've never read that anyone has verified. There's stories about tombstones being destroyed and records being destroyed when he came to power, but whether that's true or not, I don't know.
He was a good painter. I've seen his paintings, and I was rather surprised. I was like, Hitler did this? It's like, it's not too bad. However, I believe he went to Vienna twice to school or whatever, and they turned him down. They said he wasn't good. Right. And I'm wondering if those people there could have been Jewish.
He believed that. See, it's interesting. He believed that was one of the origins of his hatred for the Jews. Was he believed that some of the artists at the Vienna Conservatory that had turned him down were Jewish. And the irony is, they said if they had accepted him, no one today would have ever heard of him. He would have gotten a job as an artist and would have maybe become a semi-successful artist. They said he could not portray human beings. He could not paint people.
He did have the Blessed Mother on there.
He was good at portraying buildings and things.
Yeah.
You've seen something?
I saw his Blessed Mother end of it holding the baby Jesus. I'm like, whoa.
Hitler did that?
Hitler did that.
Sorry,
Unless they screwed up or whatever, but at least that's what I saw. Take a look
He
out
always
there.
said he couldn't do human figures.
Human faces are not easy to do.
True.
Yeah.
Eisenhower could do them, but human faces are not easy to do. But from what I have read, even his father was telling him, you're not going to make it in school. I mean, as far as painting. And he got ticked with his father on that. So he was denied being able to become the painter that he wanted to be. And so he started getting... Also, he was gassed twice and shot once in the Great War. So with that could have made him go crazy. But in 1919 is when all of a sudden he comes across the Nazi Party. And so he figures these guys may be worthy of me. And he will step in 1919 to start to move his end of it forward. And I've read at least up to page 600 of the book Mein Kampf. That is a book to read. It's like wow.
Reading the phone book.
Yeah.
It's
But what's interesting is that he had somebody as one of his first people to read it was Winston Churchill. I'll see exactly what this guy wants to do and what his plans are, but he wanted the fatherland to be number one. And what I look at, what's rather interesting, he felt that the Jews, I believe the Jews were like the upper 1%. They were the ones that controlled all the jobs, all the money, all this kind of stuff. So if we turn them into the enemy, guess what? These are the people that could possibly save Germany. We're just going to turn it around and, okay, guess what, guys? There's your enemy right there. In the meantime, we're stealing from your wallets and everything else. And if you don't come along with us, we'll start with the weakest link first, which is your children. We are going to go after your children. We're going to turn them from like little children into Nazi soldiers. And by the way, now that we're having this class, Johnny, can you tell me, does your father put his arm out, extended out like that towards Herr Hitler? No, my father doesn't believe in that. Well, Johnny, what does your mother do? Does your mother put her arm out like that? No, my mom doesn't believe in that either. Oh, really? So guess what? His father goes to work, never comes home. His mother goes shopping, the whole house is ransacked. So guess what the other people are going to start doing? See Kyle, they're going to put their extend their arm out to the Hitler salute. We got him. The weakest link is what he stresses throughout that book. We're going to go after the weakest link, the smallest mind. That's the person to catch first. And then beyond that, then you thrust forward.
There was a lot of class hatred in
Yes,
his hatred
there
of the
was.
Jews. It was the rich Jews.
There you go.
It wasn't just it was they were rich and they didn't deserve to be rich. That this
Bingo.
money had been stolen from the good German people.
You got it.
And he played on this fact because there were Jews that owned department stores. But very big thing about department stores. That the Jews owned all these department stores in Berlin. It was very visible because the Jewish names, and he played on that. One of his platforms was, we're going to confiscate all the department stores and take all that wealth away from the Jews.
Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What surprised me is I thought Hitler started the Nazi Party.
No, he joined into it.
Okay.
He joined into it.
It was called the German Workers. It was a little hole-in-the-wall group called the German Workers' Party, the Deutsche Arbeitspartei. And he added the word National Socialist. He created National Socialist, but it kept the old name. It remained the NSDAP, the National Socialist Deutsche Arbeiterspartei, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. If you ever see one of these, if you ever go to a museum or something, you see one of those party badges that they had, a little circle in red with a swastika in the middle. It has on there NSDAP, National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Jim, do you have the story of how a pretty big name in German forces like Ludendorff became involved in the early Nazi movement?
You got me on that. Go ahead.
Just kind of hit me.
That's all right. Go ahead.
No, I don't know. Sure, but it was a name of some importance. And
I can give you. Ludendorff was essentially second in command to Hindenburg during the First World War, but Hindenburg was essentially a front. Ludendorff was really running the war in the First World War. Hindenburg was already then was an old man. He had been retired. Hindenburg had retired, I think, in 1911. So he was called out of retirement for the First World War. He was already well into his 60s, which in those days was considered to be much older than it is today. And Ludendorff becomes his second in command. Ludendorff is not an aristocrat. He's not a von. Ludendorff never gets the von attached to his name. Ludendorff never becomes a field marshal, in part because he's not an aristocrat. And and Ludendorff, after the war, developed many of the same ideas that Hitler would play on. This sort of pagan nationalist Germany, the German history going back to antiquity, and a very pagan form of antiquity. He was not a Christian. And he actually was a candidate for president in the 1920s. Ludendorff ran as a nationalist candidate for president in the early 1920s, but in the same election that Hindenburg ran in. And Hindenburg was much more popular. Hindenburg, for want of a better comparison, is more of the Eisenhower. He's more of the affable, likable, jovial. He was able to project an image of being a grandfatherly figure, where Ludendorff was a man that conveyed force, and he was not popular.
And Hindenburg looked the part too, pretty much.
Oh, sure.
Impressive-looking fellow.
So he became attached with this National Socialist German Workers' Party. He's at the putsch. When they attempt to take the beer hall putsch, Ludendorff is there marching, and when Hitler hits the deck, and many of the rest of them begin running for their lives, Hindenburg remains ramrod straight when the police are firing at them.
You mean Ludendorff?
Ludendorff. Ludendorff surrenders and but I think is released. I think because of his great name in the war, he's not prosecuted. But Hitler eventually broke with him. You can imagine Ludendorff having been, his title was First Quartermaster General in the First World War. He was essentially the chief. He was Hindenburg's chief of staff, you might say. The idea of him being subordinate to this little corporal, this little Austrian corporal, didn't sit well with Ludendorff. Well, Hitler was going to be the boss, and he wasn't going to let even a man of Ludendorff's prestige cut in on his power. So they broke. Ludendorff was essentially pushed into the background. He dies in like 1935. There's some talk that Hitler offered him a field marshal's baton when he came to power, and Ludendorff turned it down. It is said. Again, it's one of those things that you read about. You don't know if there's evidence for it or not. But Ludendorff really had very little political influence in the post-war world. But he was for a time connected with the Nazis.
And the whole story of the relations between the Nazis and the Kaiser, who was in exile in Holland, neither had any strong use for the other.
No.
Hitler had no desire to bring the Kaiser back to any form of authority.
Hitler was a clever enough politician to give hints to the monarchists that he would be sympathetic. But there was no way on earth. Hitler
didn't like losers.
Well, it was more that Hitler did not have a respect for the monarchy. He once said that he says, you have to say one good thing for the socialists. They got rid of the monarchy, and that was a step forward. Hitler was a revolutionary. Hitler was not trying to restore the old regime that had been overturned in 1918. Hitler had no sympathy whatever for the Kaiser, for the aristocracy. He hated the churches. I mean, he hated all the old established institutions. The rich, the industrialists, he loathed them all. He had no intention of giving any power to any of them.
Hindenburg didn't like Hitler.
No.
Hindenburg, according to Winston Churchill's book, when they approached Hindenburg on Hitler and said, "Hey, wouldn't you have it within your ranks?" He says, "You know what? I'll talk to him." And he says, "You know what? As far as I'm concerned, I'll make him postmaster general. He can lick my face as far as I'm concerned." That's what he said.
There's an old story that the first time Mussolini met Hitler, they met in Italy, and Mussolini, it was going to be just a one-on-one between Mussolini and Hitler. And he told some of his men to stay out in the courtyard because if he wanted an excuse to leave, he wanted to be able to signal to them to come up and tell him there was an urgent message from Rome or something. And the story is that after he'd been with Hitler for about 3/4 of an hour, he walked to the windows of this balcony. And you can't do this over the radio, but he sort of looked around to make sure that Hitler wasn't watching him. And then he made this circular motion.
Really?
He made this to his aides down in the courtyard.
That's
he made this circular motion
nuts.
as to say that this guy is nuts. This guy is nuts.
Wow, that was Mussolini.
Yeah, yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
Yet he made the Pact of Steel with Hitler a little
Yeah.
later on. Yeah.
Hitler had sent when Hitler was just an aspiring politician in the 20s. He sent a fan letter to Mussolini. Mussolini's already Il Duce. He's already the leader of Italy, and he sends him a letter asking for an autographed picture. And the story is that Mussolini wrote on the letter, "Denied." That's what, they have the copy of the letter. He just wrote on it, "Denied." He wasn't going to be bothered with this small-time German politician from Bavaria.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Hitler knew how to stroke people.
And Hitler was never voted into office by any majority of the German people.
No.
He never won an election except in
They
the Senate.
had
That
They had
Reichstag fire. That ought to do it.
That brought him in pretty much.
They had the largest single party, and I mean in the final elections that they held in '32, he had the largest number of seats, but it wasn't a majority.
Right.
The only way they bring him in with a coalition with the Nationalist Party and with von Papen as his vice chancellor, and the idea was that Papen was going to be the brains. And that
he could control Hitler.
And of course, everybody knows what happened to that.
Yeah.
Talking about Hitler, excuse me, eliminating opposition, the famous Night of the Long Knives. How many people lost their lives in that particular incident?
There was hundreds, perhaps thousands. They settled their scores with everybody. Hitler wanted to get rid of what was called the SA, the Sturmabteilung, which means the storm troopers. We hear that term, stormtrooper. Stormtroopers had been special troops in the First World War. They were like shock troops that would be at the head of an offensive. You'd send your stormtroopers ahead. These were your crack troops. Well, Hitler set up his brown shirts. They're known to history as the brown shirts, under a captain named Ernst Röhm.
Right.
And he was the head of the brown shirt SA. Ernst Röhm was a radical revolutionary. He was a socialist. He thought that when the Nazis came to power, we were going to grab everybody's wealth, grab all the estates, all the property, and redistribute it to the Nazis. Well, Hitler didn't want to do that at that point because he needed the industrialists. He needed these people at that time to consolidate his power. Well, Rome is making noises that, well, if Hitler doesn't want to do it, maybe we need to get rid of Hitler. And he was talking about a second revolution. We need a second revolution. Well, Hitler decided that, and the army came to Hitler and said, "You've got to get rid of this guy. We're not going to tolerate this aspiration." Rome wanted to become defense minister. He wanted Hitler to make him the commander of all the armed forces, and there was no way the army was going to settle for that. And at this point, the army could still talk to Hitler with authority. Hitler still needed the generals. This is 1933 and 34. So what happens is Hitler decides he has to get rid of them, and the result is what's known to history as the Night of the Long Knives. When Hitler shows up, the brown shirts are having their annual convention down in a place called Wannsee in Bavaria, and Hitler shows up unannounced with the SS, with this other unit that he's created. Yeah, the SA, the SS was sort of an offshoot of the SA. He shows up with Himmler and troops of the SS, and they round up all the leaders, including Ernst Röhm, and some of them are given a choice. You know, the old story: you lay the revolver with one bullet in it on the desk in the cell, and you walk out, expecting the fellow to do the right thing.
Isn't that what Rome did? I think
Rome refused to commit suicide.
Right.
After repeated attempts, they finally shot him. He refused. He refused to take the hint.
Right, he was given the offer.
Yeah,
but wasn't there an undercurrent of homosexuality here?
Oh yeah, Rome definitely was, and that was the cover story. That was the cover story that was used. The cover story was that Hitler had discovered this nest of perversion and immorality that was going on. Well, the fact of the matter is everyone in the upper echelons knew about Rome and knew what had been going on all those years and hadn't bothered them in the least until now they needed an excuse to get rid of Rome. All the rest of his leaders were shot, and Hitler used the opportunity to settle scores with everybody else that he wanted to get rid of. including the people who had opposed the putsch back in the 1920s and politicians that had opposed him. And some people were shot simply because they had a name similar to someone else that was on the list. There were a number of innocent people that were shot simply because their name was similar, and the SS troops weren't too careful in checking addresses. And there was stories of a doctor. A doctor gets a knock on the door. He opens the door, and bang! There's a guy standing there with a gun. He's shot down. He wasn't guilty of anything. He just had a name similar to someone who was on their list. It was a bloodbath, but it also impressed upon everybody that Hitler meant business. That he was not. Papen was supposed to have been shot, but Hindenburg ordered troops to protect Franz von Papen, the vice chancellor. But shortly after that, he's sent off on an ambassador's position. But that was 1934, the night of the long knives. And the end of Ernst
Didn't they
Röhm.
shadow people too to where, okay, I'm shadowing this fellow here, and all of a sudden I'm going to be taking your place tomorrow morning. You don't know it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That was like, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They had Hitler's his foreign minister. He got rid of when he comes to power. He still had a cabinet. It was still like an old-fashioned government, and they had put these aristocrats and other people in the cabinet. Well, Hitler one by one. He wanted Nazis. He wanted subordinates, and he didn't even want a cabinet. Hitler didn't want any. He didn't meet with people, and Hitler simply gave orders. He wanted simply functionaries that would do as they're told. So the foreign minister was an old aristocrat named von Neurath, and Hitler, I think, brings him to the chancellery office and gives him a pat on the back and tells him what a good job he's doing. And when he gets back home, there's another call. You have to go back to the chancellery. So he goes back to the chancellery. Oh, by the way, you're relieved. You're being removed from office, and we're replacing you with von Ribbentrop, the champagne salesman. So von Neurath's dumbfounded. He's just been told what a great job he's doing, and like 2 hours later, he's fired and he's out on his ear. But fortunately, he wasn't taken out and shot. He was simply fired and was not, put against a wall and shot the way Rome was. But Hitler was he wanted absolute power. There was no structure of government under Hitler. There was just Hitler, and people did as they were told. The Reichstag is just an audience. He assembles the Reichstag whenever he wants to give a speech. The only function they have is to sit there and applaud when he gives a speech. And then at the end, they vote unanimously for whatever it is he decreed. Sounds almost like I'm not going to say.
Yeah. Okay.
We've heard it before.
To run local too.
So we're. Anyone else have any comments about Adolf Hitler?
Well, a name comes to mind, John. Horace Greeley von Schacht.
The economic
Did
wizard.
he come in a little later on in the Nazi regime?
He was the economic wizard. He was one of those so-called conservatives that were put into the government early on, but eventually he gets rid of Schacht as well. He got rid of Schacht.
That good name of Horace Greeley.
But he had economic understanding, which most of the Nazis didn't. And he did have some success in putting their finances on a secure footing, putting the mark. The mark had been reduced to paper, play money in the 1920s during the inflation. You've heard the stories where it took trillions of marks to buy a loaf of bread in the 1920s. Schacht rebuilt Germany's currency, put the economy on a fairly reasonable footing. And for his labors, he was fired because he wasn't a thoroughgoing Nazi. I think Schacht winds up in the dock at Nuremberg.
I think so. That's.
But I think he may have been one of those that was exonerated. There were a few that were acquitted at Nuremberg. Either that, I don't even believe he got a sentence. I'm not even sure Schacht got a prison sentence. I think he was one of those that was acquitted at Nuremberg. Hjalmar, Horace Greeley, Schacht. And von Ribbentrop, Goering used to call him the champagne salesman because he had married the heiress of the Heinkel Champagne Company in Germany. And he acquired the von. He wasn't born von Ribbentrop. When he was a middle-aged man, he persuaded an elderly aunt to adopt him. And the aunt came from a branch of his family that had the von, the aristocratic von. So by having his elderly aunt adopt him when he was, 30 years old or whatever, he was able to become von Ribbentrop. And of course that was ridiculed by just about everybody else, but he wanted to be portrayed as an aristocrat. And he's known to history as von Ribbentrop.
Right. He was instrumental in that non-aggression pact between
it's the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
And as we touched on it, you'd wonder to what extent surely somebody like Stalin knew that ultimately there would be war between Russia and Germany, given these two rival totalitarian states. But maybe he, in a sense, as I think most historians would say, was just buying time for Russia.
Well, that's the story that Stalin loved to put out after the war. That was the story that Stalin, the official line was Stalin had brilliantly foreseen that Germany would one day attack Russia.
Not give him too much credit,
but he had to buy time. He had to buy. The fact of the matter is, Stalin fell for Hitler hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah.
He believed it. He trusted. He trusted Hitler far more than he ever trusted Roosevelt or Churchill. And he was Russia was a far better ally to the Germans in 39 and 40 than they ever were to the United States and Britain. They squabbled and dickered with us over everything. They gave Hitler whatever he wanted. They sold him, gave whatever they could do for the Nazis. They did. And when Germany invaded, when Hitler invaded Russia, Stalin collapsed. He was shocked. He trusted Hitler. He couldn't believe that his friend had betrayed him. He goes out to his dacha for days. He won't communicate with anybody. Many of the defeats the Russian army suffered was because there's nobody answering the phone in the Kremlin, and none of the others. They were all afraid of what to do, because if they made the wrong mistake, he'd have them shot. And the story said when the rest of the leadership, Molotov and Malenkov and Khrushchev and the rest of them, came to his dacha, when he looked out the window and saw this car pull up and he thought they were coming there to arrest him. Stalin thought that the jig is up. I'm going to be taken out and shot. Instead, they came in and said, oh, great Stalin, lead. How are we going to win this war? Then he regained his nerve. Then he immediately began giving orders and do this and do that. But he believed in Hitler. Churchill tried to warn him. There were intercepts. There were spies that had picked up information. The British tried to warn Stalin, and Stalin thought it's just British propaganda. He said, the British want us to pull their chestnuts out of the fire. He wouldn't believe that the Germans were going to attack.
Oh, that's right. Well, now it's time for our final intermission. You're listening to Meet the Chicago Historians.
Now that the warm weather has finally arrived, it's time to plant your flower garden and your vegetable garden. It's not too late to start planting your flowers and vegetable garden. And I have just the right place for you to go and get your flowers and vegetable plants. You can go to Pesky's Flower Gift Shop and Garden Center and Greenhouse at 170 South River Road in Des Plaines, Illinois. Pesky's has a very large selection of flowers, vegetable plants, and much, much more. Whatever you need for your flowers or your vegetable garden, you can find it at Pesky's. Now, they are located at 170 South River Road. They are just north of Route 14 or Minor Street, and south of Gulf Road, which is Route 58, on the west side of River Road. And be sure to stop in and visit their flower and gift shop. Again, Pesky's Flower Gift Shop and Garden Center at 170 South River Road in Des Plaines, Illinois. River Road is Route 45, and they are just north of Route 14 or Minor Street, and south of Gulf Road, which is Route 58. You can call Pesky's at 847-299-1300 for more information. So once again, Pesky's Flower, Gift, and Garden Center at 170 River Road in Des Plaines, Illinois. And their phone number, once again, is 847-299-1300 for more information.
Now back to our special edition of Meet the Chicago Historians. John?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Rich Lang, our intrepid announcer. This is our final segment, our final 30 minutes of our May edition of the Meet the Chicago Historian Show. We're at the John DeVita Broadcast Center. Let's go around the table one more time and give our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. I'll start to this gentleman right here in the blue shirt. Bill?
Bill Kugelman, and again, I want to remind everyone, 5218 South Western Avenue. This Saturday we will be open from 10 to 2, and that's at the Fire Museum of Greater Chicago.
Jim Gibbons, historian. I based out of Marengo, small little town.
Tom McKenna, retired Chicago Police.
Don Peter from Oak Park.
Your announcer, Rich Lang, and I've been known to live in the past. I'm a great reminiscencer. That's right.
I'm one of those I would love to literally live in the past if it were an option.
You pick a day or
I would enjoy that.
Yeah,
I just saw. Jim, we've talked about Hitler. We've talked about General Eisenhower. D-Day itself. Would you have some comments and things you'd like to say about the invasion, the landings, the battle at D-Day? Anything you'd care to add, or
Jim, if I could just interject, to what degree was the weather important at these?
The weather was very, very important. You had to have the moon, the tides, all that right there. Had it not been perfect on the button, they would have had a problem. In fact, they wanted to land June 5th on there. In fact, there were 3 different months that they wound up taking into consideration. One would be May, but that might be too soon. Then there was June, and then there was July. Had they gone towards July, they were worried that Rommel might be able to pick up on the whole thing. So they were hopeful the best time for them would have been about the 5th of June. However, they had like a monsoon type of weather kick on in that very day, and Eisenhower turned around. He had to wait an additional day. There was a weather person there, a man who was big in the weather. It wasn't Skilling, but he
Scottish, I think.
There you
he
go.
was a Scot.
There you go. And so he had made the recommendation that the 6th looked like it was going to wind up opening up. And so Eisenhower was going to take that gamble. In fact, Eisenhower, as Truman would say, the buck stopped at his door, because Eisenhower said that he would take full responsibility for the defeat of the Normandy Beach landing, because of the fact being they didn't know if it was going to make it or not, but they had all these things that they had to plan in southern England to come across that channel to get over towards Normandy. And what's interesting is the fact that the English figured, okay, well, we're going to have to go for it. So everybody had to come into the southern end of England to travel across. And so that meant that all the planning, everything was there, and it had to be kept in utter secrecy, total secrecy, because if Rommel or Hitler or anybody found out about that landing, they could, it could destroy everything. So Eisenhower had it, again, the moon, the tides, all that had to be absolutely perfect for them to come in for this landing. And it was very, very large. In fact, at the very end, over 9,000 will lose their lives because of Normandy Beach. In fact, 3,000, I want to say, lost their lives on Omaha Beach that first day. So it was very, very important. It was the largest amphibious landing we ever had, and that was the turn of the war. They were trying to eventually go towards a place after they were done with Normandy. They'd head across towards a place called the Ruhr, and that happened to be where all the coal and all that all his munitions came from that area there. And so that's what they were heading for. So
if they had waited, they as you mentioned, there was May,
yeah,
June, and July. And they were teetering on waiting until July. Had they waited, the weather on the days, and they had to pick these days based on the moon.
Yeah.
They needed a certain type of moonlight for the
winds,
paratroopers.
the tides.
They had to coordinate it with the tides. So there were only like maybe 2 days, maybe 4 in a month where all these factors would come in. If they had waited until July, the weather was horrible on the dates that they had picked for July. If they had waited, there would have been no invasion. There was like a tremendous storm in the channel on those designated, and then by August it's too late. By August they simply the factors wouldn't mesh together, and it would be too late in the year to be starting, so it would have been put over into the following year.
How did they keep the buildup in England secret? Because they had been tremendous buildup. Just people is forget about guns and in trucks and all that stuff. I mean, that had been
tremendous.
One of the biggest success stories
because
in world history to have that keep it quiet.
That's it.
Churchill, someone once said there were so many American GIs and so many tanks and planes and guns in England that the only thing that was holding the island up were the barrage balloons that they had over London. That was what was keeping the island afloat. They didn't. I mean, everybody knew we were building up troops there, but the diversion was to this notion that they were going to land at the Pas de Calais. They weren't going to come in Normandy. It was where are they going to go? Where are they going to attack? Right. And Hitler, of course, builds these. They built fortifications over the whole French coast. I mean, they had guns and everything in all these places that were never touched. I mean, they spent a fortune building all these concrete bunkers and artillery positions and all. And
underwater mines.
Most of it was just ignored them. I mean, we came in at Normandy. The rest of it was meaningless.
Right.
So it was, and even what they had at Normandy, they pounded it. We had battleships. They had the battleship Nevada, which had been at Pearl Harbor, was one of the ships that was pounding the beaches at Normandy. The British had battleships there pounding the beaches, and all those obstacles and everything really in the end didn't accomplish very much of anything.
What were the presidents saying? The Americans are overpaid, oversexed, and over here or something like that?
It goes back, right.
If you go over there, you can still see all of that.
Yeah, I was there.
I was there 50 years ago. My son was born at the Army Hospital over there. And from the hospital, you could see all the embankments and all of these gun turrets, and it was still there. And I assume that it still is.
Well, some of those battleships, if they had them in the Thames River, or along the shore of England, they probably could have launched right across. Because those battleships, they had a. 40 or 50 miles?
Well, battleship gun about 20 miles, 15 to 20 miles on a 15 or a 16-inch gun. But the thing is, they could only open up just a short time before the invasion, because if they'd pulled them up there 3 days in advance, they would have been telling everybody this is the invasion. So they didn't open up until just at dawn, just before the wave is going to hit. So they had a very short time to pound the beaches. The Air Force had been going in, but the Air Force had been bombing everything. From the air attacks, you couldn't tell exactly what, because they were hitting everything. And
bridges and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. But, there's that famous scene in The Longest Day where the German soldiers looking out at the horizon, and there's nothing there. And all of a sudden, he looks out, and then in just a flash, you see all these ships when they cross the horizon. There's that moment when all those ships... And he calls up headquarters and says, "It's the Allies. They're coming. They've got 5,000 ships." And the officer back in the headquarters says, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. The Allies don't have half that many ships." And just then they cut loose and they hit this bunker, and there's a shattering. The beams come caving in.
Right.
The guy in Berlin says, "What was that?" He says, "That was those 5,000 ships the Allies don't have."
And what was the timing of D-Day in relation to the V-2 rockets?
Very close.
Very close. That's a factor, too.
They start launching the V-1s within weeks of the attack. I think it's in July or August they begin launching. May have even been July. They began launching the V-1s at London.
I thought
and
that
the V-2s came very shortly after that.
Okay, that timing was.
I thought the V-1s were shortly after the Blitz.
No. No, the V1s, the V2, they're both in 44.
Okay.
Both in 44. In fact, one of the things One of the things Hitler, when the generals were pleading with him, they needed more tanks. Hitler says, "Don't worry about that. I've got these secret weapons that are going to win the war." And they did. Of course, they didn't all know about it, but he thought these were going to win the war. He thought all he had to do was destroy London, and that's going to be the end of the war.
Were the V2s the first intercontinental ballistic missiles?
No, V2s are short range. They're not even
Very short.
V2s are they're not even what they call intermediate range missiles. They're very short range,
Okay.
200 miles.
Okay.
They had to be very close, to the coast in order to hit.
Did they have guidance systems?
Oh yeah, they're guided. They are guided.
Like the V1s, they just put enough fuel in it.
It's a buzz bomb. They had a guidance
Buzz
system.
bombs is
Buzz
right.
bomb. The V2 is like the V1 is like a cruise missile. It's what they
Right.
call a cruise missile today. It wasn't. The V2 would actually go into the stratosphere
Right.
and then come down. That's a ballistic missile. The
Right.
V2 flew in a straight line,
Right.
like an airplane. The
And-
V2 was like a little rocket-powered airplane.
And
They
the
were
Air Force,
shooting the V1s were shot down.
and I heard they were
Fighter planes could
touching
shoot
the
down
wings with
V1s.
a fighter and
You could knock them down. You could hit them, hit the wings,
hit the gyroscope,
and
and
they'd go haywire and
Right.
spin off. The British had jet aircraft in World War II. They had a-
ME-260s.
They had the Gloucester Meteor, and there were British jet aircraft that shot down V1s. So we're looking ahead to our next broadcast will be on June the 17th, our June edition. This is our May edition. We're about just a matter of days now from the anniversary of D-Day. There are a number of anniversaries this year. This in 2019 will be the 75th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, which took place in the winter
Right.
in December. It'll be the 75th anniversary of the landing at Leyte Gulf, which was the beginning of the invasion of the Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the greatest naval battle ever fought,
Right.
was fought in the Philippines.
Was
in
that the
summer.
Marianas Turkey Shoot?
That was before. The Marianas Turkey Shoot was a little bit earlier than that. That was where they shot down something like 300 Japanese aircraft. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. That was the end of the Japanese Air Force as an effective force. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the end of the Japanese Navy as a fighting force. They lost virtually everything they had remaining in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was at the time of the landings that began the invasion of the Philippines, which my dad was involved in. So we've got a number of 75th anniversaries coming up this year. The Operation Market Garden, which was Montgomery's attempt, the Bridge Too Far. Remember the motion picture called The Bridge Too Far? Montgomery thought that was the way to win the war quickly, and it almost worked in the aftermath of the invasions at Normandy. But the big one, of course, the one that is going to get the most attention is in just a few weeks, June the 6th. I understand the president is going, so there's going to be another big celebration, as they had in '84 when Reagan went to Normandy. So
Did Obama go to the...
his Obama's years didn't coincide with an anniversary. Bush, there
Yeah,
was
maybe that's why.
2004. Bush was president, and they had the anniversary celebration in 2004. So that would have been the 60th anniversary.
Okay.
Clinton, I think, in '94. I think they had ceremonies Clinton attended in '94.
Okay.
So they've been doing this since '84. They've had anniversary every 10 years. Now they're doing this year. They're doing the 75th.
John, say a little bit more about Montgomery's role in this whole thing, because he's known as a prima donna, at least.
Well,
What was his...
he had an ego, and the fact of the matter is, most people at that level have egos. You don't get to be in a leadership position in
Like
government or in the military if you don't have an ego. Some know how to mask and that was Eisenhower masked the ego, but Eisenhower had a tremendous ego. Eisenhower refused to go to the surrender ceremonies in Berlin when Zhukov was going to have the formal ceremony. Eisenhower refused to go because he outranked Zhukov. Because Zhukov was not a theater commander. Ike was the supreme Allied commander, where Zhukov was just an Army group commander. And Ike said, I'm not going to go there to a ceremony that is presided over by an officer that is of a lower position than I am. So Ike had an ego too, but he masked it. But Montgomery Montgomery was a great officer. He had a very distinguished record in the First World War. He had been decorated in the first weeks in 1914. As a young officer, he distinguished himself in France. He, after the war, was given training assignments. In the 1930s, he's in the Middle East. He is interesting. He's suppressing Arab terrorists in Palestine in 1938 and 39. He's with the British forces in Palestine just before the war, fighting Arab terrorism. Does this sound somewhat familiar with what's going on today? He distinguishes himself then in World War II in Dunkirk. And he's given the command of British forces in North Africa. He commands the 8th Army, and he defeats Rommel at El Alamein. When he becomes a Viscount, when he's given a peerage, he becomes Viscount Montgomery of Alamein in honor of his great victory there. He was a great organizer. He had an ability to organize troops, an ability to train and to inspire troops. He was admired just as much. They say he was a prima donna, but he was admired by the ordinary British soldier. They looked upon him as a man who was concerned about his troops. He had a reputation for looking out for his soldiers. He wanted the best for them. And in Montgomery's forces, the food would be good, the uniforms, everything would be good because he took pains to make sure that they had everything that they needed. And he had a reputation for that. He wanted to be the supreme commander. He wanted to be what Wellington had been. He knew about the great leaders of British history. But in this war, America was the dominant power.
Was he a graduate of, Sandhurst?
No, I don't think so. I don't believe he was. He was the son of a clergyman. And I'm not sure if he went to. I'd have to look. I'm not sure if he was a graduate. He was. It's possible because he was already a young officer in World War I, so he was a professional soldier, and may have gone to Sandhurst. I don't want to say yes when I'm not positive, but he was a professional soldier, and he. Churchill had to kind of explain to him that, Monty, the Americans are running this war. We're no longer the senior member of this partnership, and you can't expect the Americans to accept an English officer as the supreme commander. But Monty could never accept that. He always thought he would have been a better commander than Eisenhower because he'd led men in the field, which Eisenhower had not. That was one of his knocks on Eisenhower, was that Eisenhower had not been a battlefield soldier the way he had been. But becomes a field marshal, becomes he becomes their equivalent of our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff after the war, and winds up, when NATO is set up, he becomes deputy supreme commander to who else? Dwight David Eisenhower. Ike once again becomes the supreme commander in Europe, and Monty is once again his second in command in the 1950s. Before Ike comes back to run for president. But he's well thought of in Britain. I mean, he's still admired as a great hero and as a great leader amongst the British. And they needed a hero. He came along at a time when Churchill said, we need a hero, and Monty was there right at the right time. And he wore these berets. He had the flair. Yeah. He had the personality that was able to convey that image of being a hero.
Ego.
So and he
wasn't there a line attributed to him that he was looking over the Ten Commandments and he said, I agree with God that these are great commandments, something like that.
Whether he said, it fit the image. It sounds like something that he would have said. Yeah.
The movie Patton really brings that out.
Yeah.
Patton really brought it out.
Yeah.
It was a great scene.
Patton says, hell, I'm a prima donna. I admit it. The trouble with Monty is he won't admit it.
That's a good line.
How did Eisenhower and Roosevelt get along with de Gaulle?
Terribly.
Story.
I heard
FDR did not like de Gaulle. FDR considered de Gaulle to be and so did Churchill. No one got along with de Gaulle.
Yeah.
Churchill couldn't stand. He was a prickly, difficult man to get along with. But in his defense, he had seen his country crushed. He loved France as intensely as Churchill loved Britain or as Roosevelt loved the United States, but he had seen his country defeated in the dirt, and it just ate him up. that this country that he loved so deeply had been beaten by the Germans, and he felt he had to project an image of greatness even though his country was no longer great. He was all, in his mind, he was all that was left of France. And he had to maintain this image that France is still great. It is still a great country. And that made him very difficult to deal with because everybody else thought, hey, you're controlled, you lead nothing, your country's defeated. But he didn't see it that way. He still saw France as a great nation. That made it very hard to get along
Where
with.
did he go during the occupation of France?
Well, he was in England. He
was in England?
He got to England, yeah.
Okay.
He led to England and led the Free French and then came back. And this is June of 44, in August, Paris is liberated, and the Allies rightly give the French the honor of being the first into. So it's French troops that are the first into Paris. And there's this great scene of de Gaulle, who was like 9 feet tall. You see him walking through the crowds, heads above everybody else. They had this procession to Notre Dame, to the great cathedral of Notre Dame. They had this mass at Notre Dame, celebrating the liberation from Germany. And he becomes the provisional head of the government. Roosevelt did not like de Gaulle. Churchill did not like him. Eisenhower had difficulties with him. But as I say, as difficult as he was, you have to try to understand it from his point of view.
Right.
He was a great man. I mean, I had great admiration for de Gaulle. He was a great man.
When he came back to lead France in the late 50s, with the trouble in Algeria.
He went into retirement for like 14 years. He said, "The hell with this. The politics of France was so chaotic. He wasn't going to be a part. He wasn't going to just be another politician squabbling." He said, "When they need me, they'll come to me."
And they did.
And when they reached the point that they had nowhere else to turn, then they in effect came to him and said, "Leave. Do whatever you want. Do whatever you want. You have complete power. We will turn the government over to you." And the France that exists today is the France that de Gaulle created.
Every little town, it seemed, in France had a street or a building or something dedicated to de Gaulle. Yeah, they really, they loved him.
He kept their pride alive.
Yep.
And in his mind, he was the successor to Joan of Arc and to Napoleon and to Richelieu, all these great men of history. He felt he was the one that was carrying all that on his shoulders, and he had to make France live again.
There was a couple things on PBS where American soldiers around now went back to France, and they said the American people, or the French people, treated these guys as conquerors and God.
Dirt.
I guess they still teach history in France.
Oh, sure.
Sure.
Sure, the frogs all have school over there.
Right.
I have, they've done some documentaries on Channel 11 that, particularly in Normandy and in those areas, the people there still remember. I mean, I've seen school kids every year. They go out to the cemeteries and they put little flags where the Americans are buried, and their teachers, and they sing. They sing the Star Spangled Banner, and the people out in the countryside where the battles were fought.
They don't forget.
They don't hate the America. They remember what America and Britain did for them, and they're grateful for what was done to them. The notion that all the French people hate Americans it's mainly Parisians. I mean, I say the Parisians hate everybody. They hate the other French people as much as they hate the Americans and the British.
And what a perfect surname de Gaulle had for speaking for the country.
De Gaulle.
Yeah. De Gaulle was a monarchist. De Gaulle wanted to bring back the king. De Gaulle, at the end of the war, thought the best thing for France would be to once again have a king, because his father had been he was a devout Catholic. De Gaulle was a devout Catholic and a monarchist, but he felt that people would not accept France. That they had not had a king for so long that he couldn't pull it off. But he considered it very strongly, trying to restore the monarchy in France.
That's interesting.
So what he did was the next best thing. When they came to him in 1958, he restored the monarchy, but he was the king. He made himself, in effect, the king, because the president now in France has all the powers that a king once had.
Right.
It's not like the old France of the old days when all the politicians were squabbling constantly. He gave him stability. Well, it's going to continue on, but he gave him stability. Well, folks, we've talked a great deal today about World War II, about the great Normandy invasion, the anniversary of D-Day, about the commander of Allied forces, General of the Army Dwight David Eisenhower, a great American president in the 1950s, and about a little bit about the villain of the piece, Adolf Hitler, and all the collateral stories. I want to thank all of our panelists who are here with us today. This is the John DeVita Broadcast Center, of course.
John, we one thing we didn't touch on is the new queen of Chicago. The monarchy is back in Chicago, and it'll be interesting to see how it's handled from now on.
Maybe we can talk about this next month.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, do you have any final words before our guest? We have Jim Gibbons here today, and as he says, he's not the Jim Gibbons from ABC. Do you have any?
Nope, I'm good. But thank you so much for having me.
Keep that
Thank you, Jim. Thank
June
you.
17th.
Thanks for coming, Jim.
Thank you.
Keep June 17th, Jim. We'd appreciate you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you can.
We'll be back June the 17th. You have a very blessed Memorial Day. Remember to honor all of our fallen troops, all who fought and died and served in defense of our country, including the gallant heroes of D-Day and all of World War II.
You ready to go home?
We will be back again in June. Flag Day is coming up. Fly the American flag on June the 14th. And now I'll for one final word, I'll turn the baton back to our announcer.
Okay. Recordings of previous Meet the Chicago Historians programs are available for your listening pleasure via the internet at www.windycityhometown.com. And you want to give a special thank you to the executive producer of Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network, John Seconda. On behalf of everyone associated with our Historians program, we thank you for listening. This is your announcer, Rich Lang. Now, so long until next time.
You have been listening to Meet the Chicago Historians from the John DeVita Broadcast Center on the Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network on Monday, May the 20th, the year 2019. This broadcast was produced and directed by John DeVita, and once again, our special thanks to the executive producer of Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network, Mr. John Seconda. Today's broadcast was pre-recorded on Monday, May the 20th, the year 2019. Until next time, friends, please be safe and thanks for listening.